The mercenaries assigned to handle the fallen arrived shortly after, their expressions grim as they inspected Organ's lifeless body. So, he's dead too. Yeah, I saw his last moments. He knew he stood no chance against 2 apprentice knights, one barely even a small success. But instead of retreating, he lunged at one, determined to take him down. The other took advantage and struck the fatal blow. That means one survived? Yeah, but Rodrigo, the guy standing next to the boss, handled him with some method.
Some method?
Killing an apprentice knight isn't easy. What kind of method are we talking about? I'd like to know for myself, haha. Not just 1 but 2. But don't ask me what he did, it was too dark to see. Their hushed conversation wasn't the only one. Throughout the camp, murmurs filled the air as soldiers and mercenaries reflected on the night's battle. There was Ernest, who had only just begun sword training yet managed to hold his ground against 3 apprentice knights. Andrew, who had slain 2 at great personal cost, then fought the 3rd until the leader arrived. And Killian, who not only survived an ambush but held his own against an apprentice knight of great success, the one leading the enemy assault. Then there was Maxime and Laura. Their arrival had turned the tide. The battlefield had been chaos until they came. Within minutes, it was over. As the night faded into dawn, a strange stillness settled over the land. The first golden rays of sunlight stretched across the sky, piercing through the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air was crisp, damp with morning dew, and the echoes of battle had long faded, replaced by an eerie silence. In the center of the clearing, the fallen had been gathered, prepared for their final farewell. Some were wrapped in blankets or cloaks scavenged from the battlefield, while others lay bare, exposed to the earth. Their faces, once contorted with fury or pain, were now still, expressions frozen in eternal rest. Beside them, their weapons had been carefully placed, a final mark of respect. Slowly, the remaining warriors carried the last bodies toward the towering wooden pyre. Their movements were sluggish, burdened not only by exhaustion but by the weight of grief and duty. The damp soil muffled the creak of boots, the only sound accompanying this solemn ritual. Maxime stood near the pyre, his expression unreadable as he gazed upon the fallen. Men he had shared laughter, fire, and drink with, men who would never rise again. Beside him, Ernest gently laid down the body of a fallen comrade. Soldier or mercenary, it didn't matter anymore. They had fought side by side, and each deserved the same respect. Ernest, you've improved quickly with the sword, Maxime said quietly.
Thank you, Chief.
I took your advice to heart. The fire crackled to life, flickering from the dry wood at the base of the pyre. The golden sunlight bathed the clearing, offering the slightest warmth to the cold morning air. The men formed a circle around the pyre, their faces solemn, waiting for their leader's words. Killian, Henry, and Altia stood among them, watching Maxime. Though he was young at this moment, he was their pillar, the heart that bound them together. Maxime raised his hand, commanding silence. The murmurs ceased. He stepped forward, his long shadow stretching behind him as he looked first at the fallen, then at the living. They're gone, he began, his voice steady, yet heavy with emotion. Our brothers. Our comrades. Those who fought beside us. They left us in the chaos of battle, but now they rest. This fire, these flames, this is all we can give them now. He paused, letting his words settle. His gaze swept across his weary men. I want to acknowledge the courage of many among us, beginning with Organ. He gestured toward the fallen warrior. A man who came from nothing, who walked the dark paths of this world, yet proved himself a warrior worthy of remembrance. He continued, honoring each who had fallen, recounting their final acts of bravery, deeds he had seen or heard. They gave their lives so that we could stand here now, he said. And there is no greater honor than to fight and fall alongside those we call brothers. Some mercenaries lowered their heads, others tightened their grips on their weapons, a silent acknowledgement of the harsh truth in his words. Their names may never be carved in stone, Maxime continued, his voice softer, but no less firm. But they will live on in us. In every battle we fight, in every strike of our swords, we will carry their strength, their courage, their dreams. That is the only immortality that matters. He stepped forward once more, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The fire crackled louder, its flames stretching higher, eager to claim what remained of the fallen. Today, we let them go, he said. We entrust them to the flames, but not to oblivion. Every battle we fight will carry their legacy. And when our time comes, may we go with the same honor. His words left an undeniable weight in the air. Killian, Henry, and Altia watched him, their eyes complicated, yet filled with newfound respect. Even Maxime himself didn't know where these words came from, only that they rang true in his heart. This wasn't just a battlefield. These men weren't just soldiers.
They were real.
And he carried the responsibility for their future. Silence returned, thick with unspoken farewells. Maxime met the gazes of his men, finding in them the same quiet determination. A soldier stepped forward, holding a burning torch. Without a word, he handed it to Maxime. Maxime raised it high, then lowered it toward the pyre. The moment the torch touched the wood, the fire roared to life. Flames engulfed the bodies in an instant, consuming them with a deep, rumbling whisper, not an act of destruction, but a final tribute. The gathered warriors stood in silence, their faces lit by the glow of the fire. The crackling flames, the distant song of waking birds, the rustling of the wind through the trees, together, they formed a strange harmony.
For a moment, amidst the loss, there was peace.
Maxime stepped back, rejoining his men. He had spoken, but now, silence would carry the rest. They stood there unmoving, watching the flames burn away the past night's shadows, until the sun fully rose and daylight reclaimed the land. The fire had long since died down, leaving behind only glowing embers and a thin veil of smoke drifting into the morning sky. Maxime exhaled softly, his gaze lifting toward the heavens. The sun had begun its slow ascent, casting a warm golden glow over the land. "I wonder how many more of these funerals I'll have to attend," he murmured, though no one was around to hear. Shaking off the thought, he turned and walked away. As their leader departed, many of the mercenaries and soldiers followed in silence, while others lingered a while longer, lost in their own reflections. At the forest's edge, the blood-stained, dust-covered warriors trudged back toward the village, their footsteps heavy against the packed earth. Villagers, already up and about, stood waiting at a distance. There was a hesitance in their posture, a silent barrier of wariness and uncertainty. Though the battlefield had been far from their homes, they had all heard the echoes of combat, the screams of rage, the cries of despair, the haunting silence that followed. Now they didn't know how to approach these returning warriors, men and women who had faced death only hours before. And yet, as the soldiers re-entered the village, something had changed. The hardened fighters who had once been ever alert, clad in armor even at their meals, now stripped away their breastplates and sheathed their weapons. The act was so unfamiliar that the villagers hesitated. Since their arrival, they had never seen these warriors without their gear, never seen them as anything but soldiers. Now they were just men. Near the farms, mercenaries picked up tools, shovels, pickaxes, wordlessly joining the villagers in their daily toil. An old farmer furrowed his brows as he watched these warriors, men accustomed to wielding swords, swing pickaxes into the soil with surprising precision. Beside him, a young woman holding a child in her arms whispered, "They're not like yesterday." The child, sucking on his index finger, stared at the mercenaries with innocent curiosity. Nearby, a soldier, still smeared with mud, bent down to retrieve a fallen wooden plank. The old farmer hesitated, then gave him a silent nod of thanks. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement that last night's battle already felt like a distant memory. By the village well, a small group of women gathered, their eyes following a mercenary who had removed his battered helmet and was now chopping wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe striking the log filled the still morning air. He had fought with blood and steel the night before, yet now, he was absorbed in this simple, repetitive task. One of the women, a widow, murmured, "They're softer than they seem." She thought of her late husband, a soldier who had been both fierce and kind. They're not always bloodthirsty beasts. When the fighting stops, they become men again. In another corner of the village, Rodrigo sat beside an old farm woman, attempting to milk a cow under her watchful gaze. She eyed him with suspicion, no doubt sensing the bloodshed that had taken place the night before. Still, the young mercenary remained calm. His movements were clumsy, but there was no malice in them. "It's harder than swinging an axe, isn't it?" He joked with a faint, sad smile. The old woman said nothing. Instead, she simply worried for him. Henry and Altia also lent their hands where needed, though their usual arrogance had faded. The blood and death of the past night had hardened them in a different way. The day passed in a strange quiet. By evening, even the meals felt different. Conversations were sparse.
Bon appetit.
"Thank you for the meal."
Good night.
Simple, brief exchanges. Maxime sat alone on a wooden chair, arms crossed, beside Andrew's bed. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows. Outside, the night stretched on, disturbed only by the distant chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Andrew lay motionless, his breath shallow. A thick bandage covered his right flank, concealing a deep wound. Every breath was a struggle, a labored whisper that betrayed his pain. The village healer had already done all she could, muttering old prayers as she applied ointments and fresh bandages. Now it was up to him, and his will to survive. Maxime leaned forward, watching his unconscious friend. "You little bastard," he muttered, shaking his head. "I hope this bed is more comfortable than lying in a pool of your own blood in the middle of the forest." A wry chuckle escaped him as he recalled the chaos of the previous night.
Just then, the door creaked open.
Terry, James, Pietro, and Izo entered.
"Still here, Chief?"
James asked, his voice hoarse. The tall, sturdy young man looked different. The night had changed him. "Obviously," Maxime replied. "Where's Peter?"
Silence.
"Dead," Izo said, his usually impassive face marred by a single tear rolling down his cheek.
Maxime's jaw tightened.
"Alessandro."
"Dead." "Rani." "Dead."
With each name, Izo's voice remained neutral, emotionless. But the weight of each word was undeniable. Of the 8 mercenaries originally recruited from Quessois, only 5 remained. Maxime clenched his fists. If I had arrived sooner, maybe more of them would have survived.
A bitter thought. A useless one. He exhaled.
War brought nothing but destruction, sorrow, and rage. But for his family, for his people, he had no choice. The alien attacks were becoming more frequent. Humanity was struggling to defend itself, just as it had during the Pyrrhon assault. And then there were the oppressive noble families, exploiting, crushing those beneath them. He couldn't allow things to continue as they were. His resolve hardened once more. Suddenly, the door burst open. A breathless mercenary stumbled inside. "Chief, urgent news." Maxime stood. "What is it?" The mercenary hesitated, glancing at Terry and the others.
"It's fine. Speak."
The man nodded, steadying himself before delivering his report. "When I arrived at the village of Ener, there was nothing left but ruins." Maxime's expression didn't change, but the room grew colder. The village walls had collapsed completely. Most of the houses and fields were burned. Almost all the villagers survived, but they lost everything. They won't last the winter without help.
A heavy silence fell.
Maxime exhaled slowly. "And the Baron's apprentice knights?" The mercenary hesitated. Of the 12 Baron Irat sent, only 3 survived. A murmur ran through the room. As for the soldiers, only around 10 escaped. Maxime's gaze sharpened. "And the survivors?" They returned to report their failure to Knight Ron. But by the time they regrouped, it was too late. The mercenary swallowed. Knight Ron was furious. He followed the trail of the men in black.
"Beyond that, I don't know." Silence.
Maxime absorbed the information without reacting. Death had become just another report.
"Good work," he said at last. "Get some rest."
The mercenary nodded and left. The room remained still, the weight of war pressing down on them all. James finally broke the silence.
"What do we do now, boss?"
Maxime looked at his men, at the flickering candlelight, at the unconscious figure in the bed beside him. He already knew the answer.
"We move."
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
"Tell everyone to stand by in case we're attacked again." "Is that all?" "What else do you want to do? We're just chess pieces in other people's hands at the moment." However, as he finished speaking, Maxime suddenly had an idea. "No, we can also make preparations on our own. There are some young, weak men in the village. Go and ask them if they'd be interested in becoming strong men, gaining glory and honor for their families." Maxime did indeed have the idea of recruiting new men. He still had plenty of money, enough to feed many people for a long time. Why young, weak men? The mercenaries were confused. Because if we take the strong ones, our relationship with the villagers would diminish. What's more, those who are weak have complexes and therefore dreams that stem from these complexes that are far more powerful than those who were born strong. Besides, don't limit yourself to this village. Ask our men to go to Honor's village. Not only the young but also the middle-aged people there must now be filled with a sense of helplessness and vengeance. Tell them that if they join us, we'll be able to help them get through the winter easily and at the same time avenge them on the nobles who regard them as mere expendables. Maxime's words flowed naturally as his ideas emerged and organized themselves in his mind. The more he thought, the more convinced he became that making this move would increase the chances of surviving this whirlwind. Why not target only weak young men this time? With most of the fields burning over there, many people have lost their jobs. By coming to their aid, we're like a lifeline thrown out to sea to people who are drowning. Simultaneously, Maxime thought of something far more important. Do any of you know the statistics of last night's battle? The few mercenaries looked at each other. Finally, it was Pietro who spoke for the others. Of the 62 mercenaries who took part in the battle, there are only 25 of us left. Maxime remained silent for a moment as he heard this number being so low. And the soldiers? Of the 10 elite soldiers and 80 ordinary soldiers who accompanied us, only 4 elite soldiers and 21 ordinary soldiers survived. For the price of his losses, we killed the 13 enemy apprentice knights, about 45 elite soldiers out of the 50 or so they were, at least 180 ordinary soldiers out of the 200 there were. This battle is a great success. Maxime turned his gaze on Andrew, who was still breathing heavily, and murmured, "A great success, eh?" In the town of Nansoy, another scene was unfolding. Baron Barton, seated behind an imposing solid oak desk, was deep in thought. Parchments scattered before him, military reports and battle plans. His face, usually calm and controlled, was marked by a gleam of impatience as he waited for the messenger. "My troops who looked after the village of Haynair have long since returned, so why haven't those in the village of Plowter returned yet? Could something have gone wrong?" No, it couldn't. According to the spies sent, the forces defending Plowter must have been even weaker than the village of Haynair. His fingers drummed nervously on the polished wood of the desk, producing a dry rhythm in the heavy silence. Suddenly, the office door burst open, shattering the stillness of the room. A young soldier, his face pale and covered in mud, rushed in. His armor was in disarray, and an expression of panic mingled with shame could be seen in his eyes. He quickly knelt before the Baron, panting. My lord." The soldier stammered, his throat constricted. He couldn't find the words, as if breaking this news cost him more than his own life. The Baron frowned, sitting up slowly in his chair. A shadow passed over his face, his eyes hardened. He could sense that bad news was about to burst into the heavy air of the room. "Speak," he ordered in a cold, impatient voice. "What happened to my men?" The soldier hesitated, sweat beading on his brow. Then, after a few seconds, he uttered the words the Baron dreaded most. We've been defeated, my lord. Almost all your men have been slaughtered. The mercenaries, the village soldiers, they were too powerful." A stony silence fell over the room. The Baron froze for a moment, as if the words had not yet taken on their full meaning in his mind. Then suddenly, his breathing quickened, and raw anger surged through him, distorting his features. He stood up abruptly, knocking the chair over behind him with a crash. His hands trembled, his eyes widened in rage. "What?" he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the room. "All my men?" "You mean some miserable villagers and a few honorless mercenaries slaughtered my troops." He banged his fist violently on the surface of the desk, sending parchments and wine goblets flying. The thud echoed through the room like a thunderclap. The soldier, still kneeling, lowered his head even further, trembling under his lord's fury. "How is this possible?" continued the Baron, unchained. "They were just a bunch of lawless mercenaries, stray dogs paid to kill. And you dare to tell me they managed to wipe out my forces? Trained men, apprentice knights under my banner, reduced to this." He paced back and forth behind his desk, his boots pounding the stone floor with violence. His thoughts muddled, revolving around a single idea: he had underestimated these mercenaries. And that was a mistake he couldn't live with. His face was contorted with anger, but also with surprise. How could a group of mercenaries, fighters he'd always considered interchangeable tools, mindless weapons, have inflicted such a disaster on his troops? Mercenaries! He spat almost contemptuously, his fist slamming down on the desk again. They have no discipline, no loyalty. How could they? He stopped suddenly, breathless, eyes burning with rage and incomprehension. His hand gripped the edge of the desk, his fingers clenched around the wood. He slowly turned his head towards the kneeling soldier, his gaze piercing like a blade. "How many of my men survived?" he asked in a lower but no less menacing voice. The soldier swallowed, his throat dry, and replied in a trembling voice, I don't know, my lord. A few elite soldiers, about 20 ordinary soldiers, probably. These mercenaries, they're formidable. They fought like wild beasts, and Baron Irat's soldiers supported them well." "Redoubtable," interrupted the Baron, his anger rising again. "They're mercenaries, they know nothing about war. They're simply individuals greedy for money but afraid of death. They're just looters, hired killers. How could they?" He paused, his breath coming in gasps, finally understanding that his own arrogance had led him to this defeat. He had underestimated these men, had regarded them as minor enemies, incapable of threatening his power.
And now he was paying the price.
Mercenaries. He murmured to himself, his gaze lost in emptiness. They were more dangerous than I thought. Already they managed to defeat some of the bandits I'd been developing for so long. They're becoming more and more surprising, and above all stronger. How is that possible? The Baron thought back to the young man with blonde hair and blue eyes, who looked so gentle and harmless. He turned to the soldier, his face dark, his gaze icy.
Go away now.
Leave me alone. The soldier hurried out of the room, head down, disappearing through the door with relief. The Baron, now alone, stood in the middle of the room, fists clenched, trembling with rage.
Thoughts swirled in his mind.
This was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. Slowly, he moved to the window, looking out where his men would never return. His face flushed with fury, he vowed never again to underestimate these mercenaries. This village, these men who had resisted him, would pay. He would find a way to break them, to erase them. But to do that, he first had to understand how they had managed to defeat him. And there was only one certainty lingering in his mind. These mercenaries were a force he could no longer ignore.
Hippocamp.
In the subdued shadow of his study, Baron Irit stood by the window, hands folded behind his back. He watched the twilight begin to descend on his lands, the fields in the distance gilded by the fading sunlight. The soft glow that bathed the room contrasted violently with the inner turmoil bubbling up inside him. Beside him, Chevalier Jack stood motionless, waiting for his lord to react to the news he had just reported. The Baron remained silent for a few moments longer, his eyes lost in the horizon, a kind of forced calm weighing on his shoulders. He should have been satisfied, shouldn't he?
Plauta was well protected.
Thanks to the mercenaries, the enemy had been annihilated. But a bitter smile played on his lips.
Saber-toothed tigers, he thought.
They'd done the job they'd been paid to do, and more. They delivered a decisive victory on top of the fact that 3 precious apprentice knights, 2 of them geniuses, were still alive. But as he'd learned the hard way in war, even victory can have a bitter taste. And this victory was overshadowed by what had happened elsewhere. He turned slowly to Jack, his gaze hardening. So the mercenaries did exactly what was expected of them, he said calmly, almost too calmly. The enemy is no longer a threat to the mine. With last night's fighting, Baron Barton should calm down for a while to digest the losses. The victory, in part, is ours. Jack nodded with some admiration.
Yes, my lord.
The first village is saved, and your apprentice knights are safe, including Killian, who is a very good apprentice knight, but also Henry and Altia, our young geniuses. How did you know that the mercenaries would have a great chance of defeating Baron Barton? Baron Irit shook his head, surprising Jack.
I didn't.
Baron Barton must not have known of their strength, so I gambled. Who could have predicted that a new mercenary group could be so strong?
But
the but hanging in the air crashed like a stone into the Baron's mind, weighing down his pent-up anger. The Baron closed his eyes, his jaw twitching with burning anger. He inhaled deeply, trying to contain the rage rising within him. His soldiers had died almost needlessly in Ina. These lands, so precious to his domain, had been reduced to ashes. All for the price of a mine. Was it really worth it? He turned abruptly, striding up and down the room, his boots pounding the floor with restrained fury. How could this happen? With so many apprentice knights and soldiers, the village should have been safe. The Baron stopped suddenly, staring intently at Jack.
What about Ron?
Where's Ron? He asked in a lowered voice, but one heavy with icy concern. Jack took a deep breath before answering. My lord. Ron, carried away by rage, followed in the footsteps of Baron Barthon's soldiers. He left the battlefield on horseback, alone. Since then, there's been no news of him. No one knows where he is. The Baron's face hardened even more. Ron's temerity had put him in danger. A danger he should never have faced alone. So he's lost? He asked without waiting for an answer. The Baron turned away again, approaching the large fireplace at the far end of the room. He stared at the flames, his mind whirling. On the one hand, he was pleased with the mercenaries' work. They'd done their part, and their brutality had wiped out the enemy. But for Ina, it was a disaster. Her lands burned, her soldiers dead, and one of her knights missing. It all irritated her deeply. Victory had a bittersweet taste, and the losses were hard to digest. But there was nothing he could do for Ron. A knight was already in the realm of the extraordinary. Sending people would be completely useless, while sending Jack would increase the risk of something happening. So let's get on with exploiting this damned mine. Baron Irit's words echoed around the room. 3 days passed quickly. After the attack, Maxime's men began recruiting men from both Plauta and Hunner villages. Recruitment was a great success, particularly in the village of Hunner. Candidate after candidate poured in. Maxime had limited recruitment to 60 mercenaries in the village of Hunner and 15 mercenaries in Plauta. With the remaining 25 mercenaries, this brought the total to 100 mercenaries, not including logistics personnel. Maxime knew this was a lot, but after a few battles and missions, this number would drastically decrease to keep only the elite. Holy shit, how is that possible? Charles, 4-star potential, affinity with dragons. Physique, 1.5. So you're Charles, are you? Maxime stood in the village inn of Plauta, and before him was the source of his surprise. A young man of 15-16, with dark, curly hair. He looked thin, but everyone in the village of Hunner knew how impressive his strength was. Many people said he was born with divine strength. Yeah, and you're Maxime, aren't you? Replied Charles with a dark face but also a slight air of arrogance. His parents were among the few victims in the village of Hunner after the attack. He had seen his parents killed before his very eyes by a few men in black as they robbed his home of its few precious
possessions.
He was therefore filled with hatred and thoughts of revenge. However, he had always been praised for his powerful physical strength, and everyone was already saying that he undoubtedly had knightly talent and would become an exceptional knight. So he retained a lot of arrogance. He was so arrogant that he wouldn't have joined Baron Irit's forces for the world. He wanted to create his own group of mercenaries and then rely on this group to perform meritorious deeds in order to gain his own territory. Recent events had disrupted his plans, but the arrival of the saber-toothed tigers was just the thing. He planned to climb the ranks quickly, defeat the mercenary leader and then become the group's leader. When he felt the change in his body, he was already taken aback, making him question himself. But for the time being, he kept to his plans, making no direct link with his integration into the mercenary group. However, this was without knowing Maxime's temperament. Maxime brought his face slightly closer to Charles's. Call me by my first name again when we don't know each other and I'll cut your head off, is that okay? Maxime's cold words refreshed Charles's thoughts directly as he nodded with a few drops of perspiration. I didn't hear anything.
It's okay. Louder. It's okay. It's okay, who? It's okay, Chief. Good.
The little exchange of greetings ended quickly, as Maxime resumed a normal position in his chair. Would you like something to drink? Maxime's sudden question disturbed Charles. A glass of water, please, Chief. Maxime waved his hand at the inn's waitress. Normally there wasn't one, but with soldiers and mercenaries pouring in, not only a waitress but a cook as well as cleaning staff were needed. Hi Maxime, hello young man, so what would you like? The waitress greeted the two guests enthusiastically and with a beautiful smile. Hi Sandrine, that'll be 2 glasses of water as well as a charcuterie platter please. Will that be all? That will be all. Okay, I'll be right back. Maxime and Charles looked at each other for a long moment, without saying a word. The noise and enthusiastic chatter around them only increased with time, but the atmosphere remained heavy between the two men, or rather for Charles. It wasn't until Sandrine returned that the tension dropped a notch. There you go. Great, thanks Sandrine. My pleasure. Maxime casually took a small piece of charcuterie. So tell me Charles, what are your ambitions, your dreams? Charles seemed surprised, wondering whether he should really reveal them or tell lies that might please a mercenary leader. But either way, he knew it was worth it for him to tell the truth. Grow up, train, get stronger, defeat you, take control of the mercenary group and then perform meritorious deeds to become noble. The next moment, he was beginning to regret having said that. It was like telling the king that he would stage a coup and take all his power by rebelling. It was like telling the king that he would stage a coup and take all his power by rebelling. But Maxime remained calm, and contrary to what Charles thought, he was smiling. Oh? And what position in the nobility are you aiming for? Aren't all nobles the same? Maxime laughed lightly. No, even nobles have classes. It goes from the baron who precedes the viscount, himself inferior to the count, then the marquis, after the duke and finally the king. Charles opened his eyes wide at this. So if I can become a duke in my lifetime, I'll be happy.
A duke then, eh?
Quite an ambition for someone who could never have the strength of an unassisted knight. Maxime looked at Charles with a certain mockery. But Charles took no notice and looked at Maxime with great surprise. Then his face turned pale. I could never have the strength of a knight. Why? Because you don't have the talent to become a knight. That means that even if I were to place a breathing method in front of you, you wouldn't be able to do anything with it. Charles lowered his eyes in rage. All his life he'd thought it a certainty that he'd become a knight. What's even funnier is that you have a talent as powerful as it is useless. Charles looked up, suspicious. A powerful and useless talent? Maxime casually took another bite of charcuterie. Yes, you have the talent to become a dragon tamer. But before Charles could become happy, Maxime poured him the cold shower. But what kind of dragon would enter into a contract with a human incapable of becoming extraordinary? Isn't that ironic? Charles was completely flustered after all this information. His thoughts were completely chaotic. Well, that was before you met me. Haven't you already felt some changes in yourself? Saying this, Maxime grinned broadly as he continued to eat. Changes? Charles was curious and intrigued. I have a talent that allows the men under my command to improve their potential. For example, for you, your potential has gone from 3 stars to 4 stars. You now have one of the highest potentials in the kingdom, if it isn't already the highest. Charles was completely shocked. He didn't know that each individual had his own potential. He was even more shocked to learn that he had one of the highest potentials in the kingdom. Even he knew from the depths of his village that in the kingdom there were at least millions, if not tens of millions of people. With that kind of potential, you could have the strength of a knight without practicing any knightly methods. Isn't that incredible? Max. Chief. Thank you for this opportunity. Whatever his arrogance, Charles knew that at this stage the best future he could hope for was alongside the man in front of him. My talent will only evolve in the future. So the people who follow me will also become stronger and stronger. By being at my side you can hope to one day become a noble and above all take advantage of your talent and become a true dragon knight. But once you're no longer under my command, you'll lose absolutely everything I gave you, and you'll more or less revert to the person you are today. Charles didn't hesitate for a second. I promise I'll stay by your side forever, and become one of your sharpest swords. Maxime smiled slightly. Eat and drink, I'll have you meet the other mercenaries after this. If people in the future, whether in the world of eternity or in the real world, knew that the famous dragon knight Charles had sworn his loyalty in this way, countless people would simply take it as a mere joke. What kind of existence is a dragon knight? Zhao Ru, one of the strongest existences on the Asian continent, is a dragon knight. To become a dragon knight is to become one of the individuals who stand at the top of the world. What prestige and honor that implies. Charles didn't know it, but he knew he could have a bright future following the man in front of him. Henry and Altia, who were eating and drinking not far from Maxime's table, overheard the discussion. So that's how it is, murmured Henry, looking at Altia. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Asked Altia of Henry. Let me think some more. Henry's mind was still muddled by the dilemma he found himself in. The days passed quickly. Maxime counted up, and among the 75 mercenaries recruited, there were 3 who originally possessed 2-star talents. 2 came from the village of Hana, while the last came from Plauta. Including Andrew, Ernest and Laura, this directly doubled the number of 3-star mercenaries in the saber-toothed tiger group. Such numbers already represented the pinnacle of mercenary groups in the kingdom. However, only a few common talents such as enhanced strength and agility were discovered. There were no special talents such as Rodrigo's or Charles's. Romuald's talent was also excellent, enabling him to surpass the limits of his potential to some extent. During these days, the old mercenaries did their best to train the newcomers. Everyone understood that the stronger the comrades, the better everyone's chances of survival. So everyone put a lot of effort into getting to know each other, as well as intensifying training as much as possible. The old mercenaries took great pleasure in observing the surprised expressions of the new mercenaries, who discovered that their talent had changed. Maxime also introduced Charles to all the old mercenaries. It didn't take long, since there were only 25 of them left. Charles was frightened when he learned that the former mercenary group had grown to over 60 members, and that after just one battle, half the mercenaries had died. Of course, this didn't include the logistical staff who had stayed behind in the bandits' cave, looking after the children and building houses in the surrounding area. When Charles met Andrew, who had already fully recovered after 3 days' rest, and saw the large scar on his abdomen, Charles was deeply impressed. At the same time, he firmly whispered to himself that he would always be very careful on the battlefield. Only those who survive will know glory, while those who die will gradually be forgotten. Of course, he kept these words to himself. In the tavern, Charles found himself with 3 former mercenaries from the saber-toothed tiger group. Charles, I'm going to teach you something about the chief. A former mercenary whispered lightly with a certain malice. His red face showed he was already rather drunk. What's that, Pascal? Charles didn't expect much from these ordinary mercenaries, but to get a good image in the group he tried to socialize as much as possible. The leader, his talent. It doesn't just consist in improving the potential of the mercenaries, hic. The red-faced Pascal began to hiccup, while his breath smelled strong. At the same time, a certain rage could be seen on his face. The other two mercenaries, who were more sober, became worried. They had all been recruited at the same time in Nansoy, and had formed a beautiful friendship together. Cut the crap, Pascal. Tristan, one of the two mercenaries, frowned and intervened with a certain firmness. But Pascal became even more annoyed. Humph. If he'd used his talent, Orta wouldn't be dead. Boom. Tristan tapped the table heavily, shaking the drinks on the table and startling everyone in the inn. A certain silence settled over the four mercenaries' table. But after a few seconds, the atmosphere in the inn returned to normal. You yourself know that if he had used it, he might have been able to save many people, but he would have put us all in danger at the same time. Tristan's words grew weaker, as sadness and a sense of helplessness could be felt in his words. Charles watched in incomprehension. Pascal was still unhappy, but said nothing. It's better this way, otherwise, if a knight had attacked us, we'd all be dead. Pascal didn't seem to agree, but continued to say nothing. Tristan, what exactly is the chef's talent you're talking about? Charles was very curious when he asked. It was the first time he'd heard of it. It's the asset of our mercenary group. Tristan's answer was very careless, not wanting to give any more details. Pascal, what's this talent you're talking about? Charles wouldn't budge. Pascal began to open his mouth, but just then Pietro, Andrew and Terry entered the inn. No matter how drunk he wasn't stupid enough to talk about it right next to important mercenaries. I hope you never know, hic. Why? Because it means the shits really hit the fan, and the group's facing extinction, hic. Because that means it's really fucked up, and the band's facing extinction, hic.
This shocked Charles.
What kind of talent could be so important and especially so powerful? This exchange intrigued Charles deeply, making him increasingly curious. Just then, the 3RD mercenary at the table intervened. Or that the boss is very angry. Bahaha, it's true, I've heard about that too, hic. Charles looked at Tristan, who was smiling ruefully, seeming to know what they were talking about. Tristan quickly recalled the anecdote about his boss being foolish enough to punch one of Baron Irit's knights in the face. Come to think of it, he was rather proud to have such a powerful and courageous leader, but at the same time he wasn't sure if it was a good thing that his boss could be so impulsive. Suddenly, a powerful voice drew everyone's attention. Everyone looked at a man standing in the inn. This was a strange man, not one of Baron Irit's mercenaries or soldiers. He was also dressed very strangely, looking like a bard. Brave gentlemen, have you heard what's going on in the south? But from the looks of your stupid faces, I guess not, haha. As he insulted everyone, most people looked at him with displeasure, while others looked at him with interest and curiosity. Stop being such a smartass, stranger, or you'll find out just how sharp my blade is. A soldier threatened the tourist in all seriousness. Go on, Ivan, tear him to pieces. Yeah, cut him into 1,000 pieces and feed them to the animals. Next time you open your mouth, it'll be to spit out your teeth, stranger. The atmosphere quickly turned chaotic as the man provoked some hot-blooded men. Stop acting like savages, and let's hear what this man wishes to say. A light voice ran through the tavern, but everyone fell silent instantly as they recognized the speaker. It was the vice-chief of the saber-toothed tigers, Andrew. Many of those present had seen Andrew's fearlessness on the battlefield, and the rest had heard about it. No one had the courage to challenge his words. Will I ever be like him? Charles's thoughts flared as he watched Andrew's poise. By sitting back in his chair and speaking softly, he had calmed countless fierce men in one fell swoop. But the stranger was not at all perturbed. Haha, thank you, dear friend, what's your first name? Andrew. Tell us this famous news or I'll let these men do what they wish with you. Oh ho, in that case indeed I have no choice but to tell you this news. The stranger wasn't at all frightened when he answered this, in fact he took it with humor. I bring news from the south, where the winter winds blow earlier than at home. Dark news, spreading like a shadow over our lands. Murmurs rose again, some exchanging worried glances. The man raised his voice to cover the low hubbub.
The orcs, my friends.
They're back. Again. This winter. A shiver ran through the room. Faces froze, Muggs froze halfway between table and lips. I was at the gates of Ravemont County, where the story goes that scouts were massacred near the border of the Black Mountains. Their bodies, unrecognizable. Tracks in the snow leave no doubt. The orcs are getting organized, and this time, they're not just targeting isolated farms.
No.
They've raised an army.
A real one.
The murmurs intensified again. Count Arden is preparing his defenses, but he's alone, far too isolated to face this threat. It is said that the orcs plan to march towards the southern lands, devastating everything in their path. The viscounts who border his domain are already on the alert, and missives have been sent to the surrounding barons, but... The bard paused, weighing his words as if to increase their gravity. Some say these creatures won't stop there. They don't just want to plunder the food as usual. The seriousness of the matter suddenly increased. If the matter was mishandled, the kingdom could lose land. They would seek to take these lands before spring. A heavy silence fell over the inn. Some of the old soldiers, those who had already known the fear of an orc invasion in their youth, suddenly looked more pallid, as if buried memories had come to haunt them once again. And that's not all, continued the bard in a lower voice, prompting everyone to listen. What do you mean by that? Tossed Andrew, frowning. The bard sighed and looked down. There's talk of alliances between certain orc tribes and humans, traders who sell them information. Others say that dark sorcerers lurk in the mountains, offering orcs powers they never had. The mercenaries and soldiers looked at each other, aghast, sensing a far greater threat looming on the horizon. So, what do we do? Asked a voice in the crowd. A young man with blonde hair, followed by a young woman with long brown hair, entered the inn at that very moment and replied. Absolutely nothing. Simultaneously, the young man glanced casually at the stranger. The latter simply smiled in response. We'll simply go where there's money. If there's no money, then you won't find our mercenaries there. As for the soldiers, try to keep your heads on your shoulders until the fighting is over. When that happens, the kingdom will already have intervened and put down the orc attack. In any case, you're overestimating your strength and underestimating the monsters in the kingdom. Panic inside the inn was immediately quelled. The boss is right, there's always someone all the way up there to block out the sky when it falls. Even if we went, we'd only be cannon fodder. Anyway, these nobles have their own troops as well as the kingdom that will support them. How can this go wrong? Maxime took one last look at the mysterious man, then went straight off with Laura. He just dropped by because he'd overheard what was being said in the inn while he was wandering around town with Laura. That man was strange, and above all he gave me a feeling of danger. Laura was worried as she said this. From the moment she'd entered the inn, she'd felt like a knife was at her throat. Yes, I felt the same way. Hoping he won't get involved in our business. Replied Maxime, while adding something else. Time is extremely important to us. As long as we give it time, the strength of our mercenary group will become powerful. Are you thinking of Charles when you say that? Not just Charles, despite his potential, it'll be a long time before he has the strength of a knight, even with the help of my talent. The two continued chatting while the atmosphere in the inn returned to normal. The bard sat down quietly on one of the stools at the inn's counter, which also doubled as a bar. What an interesting young man, to be able to be so strong but also gather so many talents around him and simultaneously have so much respect from his subordinates. He really is exceptional. Each of these points could make him a genius even in the Empire, but he had to possess only a low-level knightly talent as well as a vulgar talent for endurance and strength. Surprisingly, this strange man could instantly analyze the talents Maxime possessed apart from his main one. He's not even a noble. At most, he could become a baron, and that would already be the achievement of a lifetime. Where can I find a true genius who could save us all? The stranger's eyes became extremely deep and mysterious. Besides, I hope the old fuddy-duddies of this kingdom's royal court don't underestimate the orc invasion, or they'll deeply regret it. Thinking of a certain existence among orcs, even he was intimidated. The mercenary who had threatened the bard rose to his feet. Stranger, why are you so quiet all of a sudden? The latter turned, and his eyes, still not having returned to the original, fixed on the mercenary. Brave gentleman, would you like me to sing you a song from my homeland? The bard's gentle voice echoed through the inn. But the mercenary who asked the question was entranced by the bard's mysterious eyes and temporarily unable to answer. But other soldiers and mercenaries saw nothing and began to shout. Go on, champion, we're all listening. You'd better sing well, considering the shitty atmosphere you created earlier. The atmosphere in the inn picked up again. No one had noticed the anomaly in the bard's eyes, except the mercenary, who was now watching with suspicion as this unknown man sang softly around the inn and set the mood. Things were going smoothly for the saber-toothed tigers. New and old mercenaries were training regularly. An apprentice knight representing the Baron had passed through the village. Maxime greeted him, and the latter explained that he had only come to hand over 100 gold coins to the leader of the saber-toothed tigers. Indeed, Baron Irat had been very pleased with the mercenaries' performance and had given them an exceptional bonus. The apprentice knight also raised the question of the villagers recruited into the mercenary group, saying that if Maxime needed men, he could apply directly to Baron Irat, who could use his power to promote them. Maxime had been surprised by these gestures, but on reflection, it was a logical decision on the part of the Baron. At present, the mercenary group was totally tied in with the Baron's territory, and once the mercenary housing was finished, there would forever be a branch of the saber-toothed tigers here. Incidentally, Maxime had sent a mercenary to Brotherhood House. Indeed, they had rented accommodation via their network in Nansoy. So it was now important to terminate this contract, since having a base in Hippocamp and another hidden in the forest was sufficient. System displays my statistics and those of the mercenary group.
Classes. Peasant level 3. Level max. Plus 3% to physique.
Swordsman level 6, plus 5% physics, 0 of 175. Unlocked a new class, 0 of 50. Physique, 2.75, plus 0.22 class bonus, plus 0.30 passive trait bonus.
Chi, 0. Skills.
Swordsmanship level 3, 10 out of 100. Frank language proficiency level 2, 36 out of 100.
Passive trait.
Plus 11% physicality when wielding a sword. 25% training efficiency with a sword.
Talent.
Nox limit level 1, rank unknown, 0/1000.
Minor stamina talent. Minor strength talent. Knight talent, weak.
Money available, 25 gold coins in the system, plus 250 gold coins, saber-toothed tiger treasury. Mercenary. Charles, 4-star potential, affinity with dragons.
Physical, 2.1.
Andrew, 3-star potential.
Physical, 2.4. Laura, 3-star potential. Physical, 2.4. Ernest, 3-star potential. Physics, 2.3.
Romuald, 2-star potential and a minor talent in physics. Physics, 2.3. Rodrigo, 2-star potential and an elemental affinity with the earth. Physics, 2.1. Tenna, 2-star potential and a minor intelligence talent. Physical, 2. Izo, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.9. Terry, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.8. James, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.8. Pietro, 2-star potential. Physical, 1.8. Joe, 2-star potential. Physics, 1.8. Iris, 2-star potential. Physics, 1.5. Wow, Charles increased his physique by 0.6 points in just 2 weeks. This 4-star talent is really scary. Maxime felt really lucky to have found a mercenary with the original 3-star potential so quickly and, above all, so easily. As expected, 3-star potentials always improve, but very slowly. It was normal for the progress of 3-star talents to slow down significantly despite the bonus of Maxime's talent. Indeed, the closer mercenaries get to the limits of their potential, the more complicated it becomes to strengthen their physique. This made Romuald's and Rodrigo's talents all the more astonishing, enabling them to quickly reach the limits of their potential and even surpass it. In eternity, nothing was set in stone. The rules were movable, and the unpredictable could happen at any moment. 2-star talents also stagnate for those above 1.7 points. The most impressive remains Rodrigo, who has broken the 2-point barrier. His talent is not only useful in combat, but also allows you to cross the limits of potential. Maxime had overheard mercenaries discussing Rodrigo's amazing exploits on the battlefield. When he spoke to him again, Rodrigo explained that he had developed the ability to create a thin layer of rock at will on any part of his body. On top of this, he felt a mysterious energy slowly strengthening both his body and mind. He knew he hadn't yet reached his limits. On Baron Irat's side, a very important person had just reappeared. His thick beard and strong odor were of little concern to the Baron. On the contrary, a broad smile of relief spread across his face. He was reassured to see his knight back safe and sound. Ron had finally reappeared. You really had me worried, Ron. Excuse me, my lord, but the thought of those bastards getting away so easily disgusted me to no end. Come to think of it, Ron had an ugly expression. So what have you been doing all this time? Ron began to explain what he'd been going through for the past 2 weeks. And he told him some frightening news. Following the troops that had attacked the village of Hainair, he inadvertently stumbled into a secret camp of Baron Barton. Inside, countless troops were training regularly. How many? Asked Baron Irit, both curious and above all anxious. I don't know exactly, but I'd say there are at least 2,000 ordinary soldiers, 300 elite soldiers and about 30 apprentice knights. In addition, it's not impossible that 1 or 2 knights are stationed there to guarantee order in the camp. Baron Irit jumped from his chair. Where did he find so many troops? Ron, who wore a solemn expression, shook his head. I don't know, my lord, but even without counting the troops resident in the town of Nankoi, Baron Barthon's military strength reaches a truly frightening level. Baron Irit sat back gently, then put his hand to his forehead. We have only 1,500 ordinary soldiers, 200 elite soldiers and a dozen apprentice knights after the battles of Plauta and Nansoi. My God, how can we have the strength to compete with so many soldiers? Especially knowing that Baron Barton has other troops in his town and villages. Baron Irit looked desperate. Baron, I've also made another discovery. What's that? Baron Irit looked at Knight Ron with some despair. Listening to discussions in the hidden camp, I heard that Baron Barton wishes to conquer the territory of all nearby barons and become a viscount directly using certain methods. Excuse me? Could you repeat that, Ron? Baron Irit thought the previous news was shocking enough, but it had to be on top of that Baron Barton wished to use a method of promotion despised by all. That is, to attack and capture the territory of other barons. The most legitimate way to climb the nobility ladder was usually to fight at the front against the orcs in the south and earn military merit. Or at least, you had to make a contribution to the kingdom. By earning military merit or making contributions, the kingdom could offer gold, precious objects and above all territory. Once strength reached a certain level and territory was sufficient, promotion to the corresponding title was easy. It was in this context that certain vicious-minded nobles found it easier to orchestrate plots, seize neighboring territories and subjugate apprentice knights or even knights in the service of other lords. As long as it was done quickly and ordinary citizens weren't affected, the kingdom remained indifferent. My lord, Baron Barton wishes to eradicate some of the nobles in the vicinity and take the land in his name. Baron Irit took a deep breath to calm himself, then remained silent for a moment. He tapped rhythmically on the desk in front of him. Then he stopped. Ron. Yes, my lord. You are to go to Baron Kenepes to the north, Baron Turquan to the south and Baron Ivan who is east of Nansoi, and tell them what you have just told me. Baron Irit's orders surprised Ron, but he nodded. I swear on my honor to complete this task as quickly as possible. Good. Once Ron was gone, Baron Irit sighed heavily. As if the orcs, more menacing than ever, weren't enough, it took a powerful and treacherous baron to pop up at the same time. He sighed, his gaze lost in the distance. I hope I can at least protect these lands. His thoughts drifted to the town's inhabitants. All those citizens who work so hard. They deserve to live in peace. He then sat back down, resuming the town's administrative affairs with an invisible weight weighing on his shoulders. As the day wore on, news of the recent battlefields had begun to circulate, and chatter was lively. In a weaving mill, 2 women were chatting by a window as they worked. Did you hear what happened in Plauta? One of them exclaimed excitedly. How did Maxime and his mercenaries win that battle? Everyone said that the enemies in black were too numerous and above all too strong. That's what I'm wondering too, replied the other with emotion. Even with the help of Baron Irit's soldiers and a few apprentice knights, it doesn't seem plausible. I hear the losses were not inconsiderable, but they still managed to repel them. In a tavern in the center of town, a group of peasants were drinking together. What happened in Ener makes me shudder, said one of them, his voice trembling. Baron Irit's soldiers and apprentices fought valiantly, but in the end they were all but annihilated. Most of the houses went up in smoke. Yes, it's a good thing the men dressed in black weren't cruel and bloody to ordinary people. The vast majority of Hainair's villagers weren't hurt. Interjected a second with relief. But what about Plauta? Interrupted another. How did the mercenaries manage to inflict such a crushing defeat on these opponents? Rumors even have it that one of their patrols was ambushed but still managed to hold off their opponents until reinforcements arrived. We're talking about at least a dozen apprentice knights. I think that if mercenaries from nowhere managed to hold off their opponents, it means that either there were only a few weak apprentice knights on the other side, or it was deliberate on the part of the opponents. In a leather shop, a merchant and his apprentice were exchanging ideas. You know, I doubt that victory in Plauta. It seems suspicious to me, murmured the merchant, pretending to fold a piece of leather. After all, how could a newly created mercenary group, and especially with such a young leader, be so strong? Perhaps he received reinforcements? Suggested the apprentice, eyebrows furrowed. But even that can't explain how they managed to win. It's not as if Baron Irit could send more soldiers by surprise to Plauta.
Or else.
The merchant tilted his head back, looking thoughtful. He's made a pact with wizards. He finished very seriously.
Ha ha ha.
Sorcerers, he said. The apprentice began to laugh until he bent double. Don't laugh like that, I'm sure they exist, asserted the merchant with certainty and confidence.
Stop it.
Rumors have been circulating for hundreds of years, but no one has ever seen the slightest trace of witchcraft. On the way, a group of soldiers returning from a patrol were chatting amongst themselves. You're not going to tell me you believe all that noise about Plauta? Scoffed one of them, crossing his arms. Mercenaries can be cunning, but they're not invincible. It's either an incredible stroke of luck, or something more dark. What's certain is that these men in black are not a threat to be taken lightly, retorted another nervously. If Maxime was able to fend them off, he must have had an ace up his sleeve. What kind of trump card can repel so many apprentice knights? I wish I had that kind of trump card too, exclaimed the first soldier, continuing to mock. In one room of a house, a group of elderly people were chatting over their homemade beer. In the meantime, you have to admit that Maxime did a good job, said an old man, his voice hoarse. Mercenaries are often seen as cannon fodder, but amazingly here, they've managed to protect the village of Plauta from attack by a powerful army. But at what cost? Questioned an elderly woman, her gaze worried. Many soldiers have fallen, and Baron Irit could be in danger. If there are further attacks, we could all be in danger. Baron Irit is a knight himself and even has 2 knights under his command. Before Hippocamp falls, we'll all have time to die naturally. That's right, you worry a bit too much, old skin, haha. What do you mean, old skin? Have you looked at yourself, you hick? This old man is still young in the head, so I may be poor but I'm immortal. Discussions in Hippocamp reflected the prevailing confusion and anxiety. Although the victory at Plauta was celebrated, it was overshadowed by doubts and suspicions. Everyone was wondering about the future, about the dangers ahead, trying to understand how the unexpected could have happened on these battlefields. In a clearing bathed in subdued sunlight, unaware that he had become the target of mockery, suspicion and above all entertainment in Hippocamp, a young man stood alone, sword in hand, in the middle of a circle of towering trees. His blonde hair reflected the golden rays that pierced through the foliage, and his blue eyes, piercing as the summer sky, were focused on an invisible point in front of him. At first glance, he appeared thin, but beneath this appearance lay a raw, controlled strength, ready to burst forth at any moment. The young man inhaled deeply, feeling the fresh, humid forest air invade his lungs. He gripped the hilt of his sword with firm determination, the muscles of his arms and shoulders tensing slightly beneath his linen shirt. The leaves rustled faintly around him, but he paid them no heed. His concentration was absolute. With a swift, precise movement, he sent a horizontal thrust into the air, cutting through the void with impressive speed. The sword whistled, as if cleaving not the wind, but an invisible enemy. Her gestures were fluid, almost graceful, but exuded a savage power, like a predator concealing its true strength until the last moment. Clang! He took a step forward and struck again, this time with a diagonal thrust. Every movement seemed calculated, controlled, but the moment the sword left his hand, explosive violence burst forth. His slender yet lithe body twisted with feline precision, each rotation using the full force of his muscles like a taut spring. He executed a series of feints and estocs with such speed that if ordinary spectators were standing here, they would see only a blurred silhouette. Drops of sweat beaded on his forehead, but that didn't slow him down. He closed his eyes for a moment, concentrating on every sensation, the weight of the sword, the momentum of his arms, the imagined resistance of his enemy. It was like a dance, wild and rhythmic, where each blow represented a battle against his own body, against his own limits. Suddenly he pivoted on himself, throwing all his weight into a circular blow that, had it struck a real target, would have cut clean through armor and bone. Breathing rapidly, he froze for a moment, his feet firmly planted on the hard ground of the clearing, watching the movement of the leaves in the wind, as if trying to capture their subtle dance, the better to integrate it into his own. His breathing gradually calmed. The silence of the forest stretched around him, almost oppressive, disturbed only by the gentle creaking of branches and the breath of the wind. He planted his sword in the ground, taking a moment to contemplate the clearing around him. The trees, mute spectators of his training, seemed to have been there for centuries, immutable and powerful. Maxime returned his hand to the sword's hilt and pulled it from the ground in one swift movement. The muscles of his arm, thin but hard as wood, tensed one last time as he executed one last stroke. This one, slower than the previous ones, marked the end of his session. Out of breath but satisfied, he ran the back of his hand over his forehead, wiping away the sweat that had begun to bead on his temples. A smile appeared on his lips. He knew he was still young, still inexperienced, but with every stroke of his sword, he felt this explosive power boiling up inside him, this strength he was constantly discovering and mastering, a little more every day. The young man sat up, his heart still racing, when suddenly an unexpected sound shattered the calm of the clearing: applause. Slow at first, then more regular. He turned his head curiously and saw a figure standing out from the shadows of the trees, striding forward, boots treading the fallen leaves. A man in armor, imposing and dignified, was gradually revealing himself in the morning light. His short-cropped brown hair faintly reflected the sunlight filtering through the trees. His face, battle-scarred but still imbued with wisdom, wore a smile that seemed both benevolent and impressed. "Not bad at all," commented Ron in a deep, warm voice, his hand stopping to clap as he approached. "I've been watching you for a while, and I must say that your mastery of the sword is surprising for your age. You have talent, far more than I've seen in some apprentice knights." The young man was taken aback by the knight's appearance. He wiped the sweat from his brow one last time, holding back his surprise. "Thank you, Ron," he replied, bowing his head slightly. Ron stared at him, his eyes piercing as if probing the depths of the young man's soul. The knight stopped a few paces away, crossing his arms over his breastplate, pondering for a moment. "You have potential, much more than you think. But brute strength and speed aren't enough to make you strong." "Oh, so how do I become a strong person?" asked Maxime curiously with a slight smile. "Here," he replied, lightly tapping his skull with his index finger. A smile stretched across Ron's lips, this time more enigmatic. "And you will be, if you keep training like this. But never forget, Maxime, that a sword is only a tool. What counts is what you choose to do with it. And sometimes, the most difficult fights don't take place with a weapon in your hand, but in the decisions you have to make." Speaking of which, he thought about the latest events that had just transpired. He turned slightly, glancing towards the darkness of the woods he'd just come from. Then he turned his attention back to the young man. "Continue on this path, and you will forge a destiny that not even the shadows can eclipse." Ron's words echoed in Maxime's mind, awakening a new feeling in him. This wasn't just the appreciation of a strong man. It was as if a path had just been laid out before him, a path he could already feel burning beneath his feet. "I'll do my best," Maxime replied simply, always humble. Ron looked at the young man in front of him with palpable intensity. Maxime, strong and charismatic, was now a feared mercenary at the head of 100 men. Ron already knew from the various reports sent by Killian, Henry and Altia just how strong Maxime was and above all, how strong his men were too. There were already many conversations in the town of Hippocamp recounting the disastrous defeat of the village of Ina, but also the victory of the saber-toothed tigers. His reputation preceded him, but the moment called for a more serious conversation. "Maxime," began Ron, his voice deep and thoughtful, "I'd like to ask you a personal favor." The young man straightened his head intrigued, while Killian paused. Silence stretched, charged with the gravity of the request that was to follow. "As you know, tensions with Baron Barton are becoming increasingly palpable. The loss of a dozen apprentice knights was critical to our high-end power. There was even an apprentice knight at the peak stage who could break through at any moment who died in that battle. I now fear that he is trying to take advantage of the situation to harm Baron Irit. The latter is not a man of war, nor a strategist like the other nobles. But..." He inhaled deeply, his eyes lost in a memory. "He possesses something rare. A humanity that, in this cruel world, is far more precious than brute strength." Maxime nodded, aware of Baron Irit's virtues. He had already made inquiries of the villagers and his men. From what he'd heard, he was a man who, despite his status, had always cared for his people, ready to listen to their sorrows and fight for their rights. "I know that, Ron. Baron Irit is a good man." "Exactly," resumed Ron, his gaze determined. "He doesn't just rule with commandments, he engages with his subjects. It's this aspect that could make him vulnerable to Baron Barthon's shenanigans. If things go wrong, he won't be able to defend himself. And that's where you come in." Maxime furrowed his brows, his heart clenching at the thought that Baron Irit might be in danger. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to stay by his side," Killian said, his tone tinged with seriousness. "Your strength and your group, the saber-toothed tigers, already represent a significant force for a baron. With your group of men, you can offer Baron Irit the protection he needs. It's not just a question of physical strength, but also of loyalty.
But Maxime shook his head.
If knights come, I won't be able to guarantee his safety. It's not just a question of safety, Maxime, said Ron, his gaze piercing. If you link up with Baron Irit, it could open doors you didn't even imagine. As a lord, he has resources, alliances and knowledge of the territory that could serve you in unexpected ways. A man like him, though perhaps weak on the battlefield, can become a valuable ally. Your destiny will forever be linked to his territory. Maxime swallowed, his mind spinning at full speed. The implications of these words resonated within him. Loyalty to Baron Irit could offer him solid support in a world where nobles would stop at nothing to achieve their ends. But deep down, he knew he was destined to reach heights unimaginable for an ordinary baron. In his mind, his group of mercenaries would forever be free of moral shackles, able to do whatever they wanted whenever they wanted. Saber-toothed tigers are an undisciplined mercenary group. I apologize, Ron. Ron looked surprised at this answer, but Maxime hadn't finished his sentence. However, if we can do anything to help Baron Irit either now or in the future, we will. Ron gave him an encouraging smile, a mixture of pride and hope.
I know you will.
Remember, this isn't just a fight for survival, but to defend the values we hold dear. Baron Irit needs your strength, and above all your compassion. The young man nodded, his eyes suddenly clearer, ready to face the role that awaited him. He felt ready to stand up for what he was, both as a mercenary and as a man with values. Then Ron set off from where he'd been in the same way he'd arrived. I hope you won't let me down, Maxime, because I really sense in you a monstrous potential that could make this world just a little bit better, Ron thought silently as he left. A pair of delicate arms appeared behind Maxime, encircling his firm, chiseled abs. I heard a noise. Who was that? Maxime turned and saw Laura's cute smile and warm eyes. It was a side she only showed when she and Maxime were together. It was Ron, Maxime answered simply, still thinking about things. I thought he was dead? Asked Laura with surprise. Not only is he not dead, he seems to have made some important discoveries. Maxime was still thinking about some of the clues Ron had left while talking to him, which led him to deduce that something very dangerous was brewing behind the scenes. What kind of discovery could worry a powerful knight like him? Laura was now confused. I don't know, but encourage our men to train more seriously. Great events could happen soon. Then Maxime thought for a moment, and suddenly a wonderful idea popped into his head. No, forget what I just said, training isn't enough for us to become strong enough for the events that will come. I've got a much better idea than that. Laura looked curiously at Maxime, sensing yet another strange idea emerging from her mind. What's your wonderful idea again, my super cute chef? Maxime ignored Laura's teasing words and announced his idea, looking at her with strong intensity. This idea will allow us to both reinforce the strength of our mercenary group, increase our numbers, discover new talents and above all, make our mercenary group known to the world. You're always so long in the tooth. Replied Laura simply, looking up. Maxime laughed lightly, then finally announced his idea. We're going south to fight the orcs. Laura's eyes widened, an expression somewhere between surprise and confusion forming on her face. She remained silent for a moment, trying to digest Maxime's words. Fighting orcs? She repeated slowly, as if making sure she'd heard correctly. You want to take the whole group south, into the middle of orc-infested mountains? Have you gone mad, Maxime? Maxime, still serene, stared at Laura with unwavering determination.
No, it's not crazy. Think about it for a moment, Laura.
We need something bigger than simple skirmishes or local contracts to make our name. The orcs represent a threat that the entire South dreads, and if we become the ones to repel that threat, we'll have proven that we're much more than ordinary mercenaries. Laura crossed her arms, her gaze skeptical. And you really think charging headlong into a war against orcs is the best way to prove our worth? I remind you that they're numerous and organized. Even the alliance, including an earl, several viscounts and barons plus reinforcements from the north of the kingdom, isn't enough to deal with their threat. Maxime smiled, a twinkle shining in his eyes. That's just it. We're not just going to charge in headlong. We're going to prepare a strategy that nobody expects, and we're going to strike where they're most vulnerable. And believe me, it won't be their numbers that stop us. Laura raised an eyebrow, a mixture of curiosity and nervousness running through her. You're always so sure of yourself, aren't you?
She heaved a sigh. Okay, let's admit it. But why you? Why us?
Other mercenary groups, even whole armies, could handle it. Maxime leaned toward her slightly, his face now serious.
Because we're different.
We have something the others don't: agility, adaptability, and above all, we're an elite force. We're not just a bunch of mercenaries blindly obeying orders. We know how to improvise and take advantage of others' weaknesses. Laura remained silent for a moment, pondering Maxime's words. She knew he was right about at least one thing: their group wasn't ordinary.
Well,
She finally said with a sigh. If you're really sure about that, then I'm with you. But Maxime, you know this isn't going to be a simple walk in the woods. The orcs are brutal, destroying everything in their path. We risk losing many more men. Maxime nodded, his expression serious. I'm aware of that. But I'm willing to take that risk. If we succeed, we'll start building our legend in this world. Laura let a small smile form on her lips.
a legend, eh?
And you want everyone talking about your name and your beautiful face in every tavern in the kingdom, right? Maxime burst out laughing. Maybe I do. But above all, I want us to become something bigger, Laura. Not just mercenaries who take contracts without thinking. We can build something lasting, something that will leave a mark. Laura rolled her eyes, amused.
Still dreaming, huh? Very good, Chief. We'll go south.
But if all this ends in disaster, I'll make you pay. Maxime nodded with a satisfied smile. In this world, he felt so free and above all, so different from the person he was in the real world. In the real world, he had absolutely no power and simply spent his days studying with the pressure of having to join a top university. Whereas in eternity, he could really do what he wanted and how he wanted. He directly controlled the destiny of 100 people. This power, it was so nice. However, if he had to choose between staying in eternity or in the real world, Maxime would always choose the real world. That was where his family was, and his reason for becoming stronger. During the day, everyone went about their business, so it wasn't a good time to get everyone together. So, Maxime ordered a few mercenaries he came across on his way through the village to spread the word that all mercenaries were to gather together tonight, in the usual forest clearing. Everyone will eat together, and at the same time, he'll announce some very important news. So in Plauta, various rumors began to circulate. Did you hear what Maxime has planned tonight? Asked Romuald, wiping the sweat from his brow.
Andrew nodded.
Yeah, apparently he's going to announce something big. We all have to be there, which is pretty rare. He glanced toward the trees lining the village. Smells like trouble. Every time he has a meeting like this, it means we're going to move. Romuald didn't seem particularly touched, but he was still curious. You think we're going to move from here? Knowing that Baron Barton certainly hasn't said his last word. If we leave, we could endanger not only Plauta but the whole of Baron Irit's territory. Andrew shrugged.
I don't know.
But in any case, we're not strong enough to take on Baron Barton as it is. The knights are just too strong for us and the apprentice knights too numerous. Continue your saga on my virtual library empire. If I were him, I'd be desperate to earn money and increase our troops. Thanks to this, we'll be able to gain strength through numbers, but above all we could have new talents like Charles, who could have the strength of a knight in the future.
The two glanced at each other. Orcs, huh? Yeah.
That's where there's the most money to be made right now. Romuald grimaced slightly. I hope if that's what it is, he knows what he's doing, because it could be very dangerous. Andrew stared at him for a moment, before letting out a nervous laugh.
Yeah, but hey.
Maxime's never been afraid of dangerous stuff. If that's what it is, we'll have to stick together. Rodrigo and Ernest strolled through the forest. Did you notice Maxime's expression this morning? Asked Rodrigo, his eyes squinting in the direction of the village. He's got that serious look, like before a big battle.
Ernest nodded.
Yes, I noticed that too. Maybe he wants us to take the initiative against Baron Barton.
Rodrigo frowned.
I thought we'd have more time before another confrontation. We lost a lot of guys last time. Do you really think we're ready to take on Barton again?
Ernest sighed. Honestly? No.
But Maxime seems sure of himself. If he has a plan, I'll follow it. Rodrigo nodded, but he was no more reassured than that. He'd already lost someone important to him. Then he looked at Ernest with gentle eyes. Do you want to fuck me or what? Look at whoever you want like that, but not me, damn it. A vein appeared on Rodrigo's angry face. Who'd want to fuck you? You're as interesting as a pebble on the side of the road. Ernest burst out laughing. Says he as he himself begins to grow dirt on his body. Rodrigo also had some repartee, as he thought about the scene where Ernest had been speared by the bandits. It's always better than being penetrated by a new orifice. The two looked at each other and burst out laughing. Fuck off, or I'll make you feel how it feels. The two walked on in good humor as they continued chatting and laughing. The evening came quickly. The clearing was lit by the flickering glow of several campfires, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding tree trunks. The mercenaries were all gathered around these fireplaces, their faces illuminated by the light of the flames. The night air was cool, but warmed by the heat of the embers and the intoxicating smell of cooking meat. Pieces of venison sizzled above the fire, while some of the mercenaries turned spits, exchanging laughter and jokes with their comrades. Discussions were going well, but under the cover of this camaraderie, a certain tension floated in the air. If this is another one of his crazy ideas, we're in trouble again, Romuald said. He chewed with an almost calculated slowness, his gaze settling on his companions seated around the fire. Terry, sitting cross-legged beside him, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before replying with an amused smile.
Oh, you mean Maxime?
Of course it's going to be a crazy idea. It's always like that with him. But that's why we're here, isn't it? For the adventure, the danger, the gold coins, and above all, the excitement of writing history. To write a story, you have to be able to stay alive, Pietro added, sounding like he was thinking about a lot of things. The previous battle had given many mercenaries pause for thought, including Pietro. The pay was high, the powerful physical strength dreamy, but the reality of blood and iron had brought everyone back to reality. They'd become powerful mercenaries thanks to their efforts and Maxime's talent, but against the might of apprentice knights it was already complicated, so against knights it could only get worse. As the night wore on and conversations gradually died down, an unexpected silence settled over the clearing. All the mercenaries sensed that an important moment was approaching. Maxime, who had hitherto been sitting on the sidelines, eating and chatting with Laura, rose slowly to his feet, his silhouette silhouetted against the glow of the flames. His intense gaze swept the assembly. 100 faces turned towards him, some curious, others slightly tense. They awaited his words. Maxime advanced to the center of the clearing, taking a deep breath before addressing his men. His voice was calm, but each word carried weight, as if marking a turning point in their shared destiny. Mercenaries. He began, drawing everyone's attention. The murmurs died away completely. You've proved to Plauta that we're not just a group of mercenaries. We've repelled forces superior in numbers, and we've shown the world what we're capable of. But that was only the beginning. All eyes were on him, some mercenaries shaking their heads with pride at the memory of past victory. Yet Maxime never smiled. His features were serious, almost hard. What I'm about to tell you tonight is going to sound crazy to some of you. Explore more stories at my virtual library empire. The tension was palpable as everyone lowered the sound of their breathing to the maximum. We're going south. A slight murmur ran through the assembly. Questioning glances were exchanged, but Maxime continued, unperturbed. We're going to face the orcs. The shock was instantaneous. Exclamations erupted, and expressions of astonishment appeared on some faces. Andrew, who until then had been relaxed, suddenly straightened up, eyes wide. Romuald cleared his throat, trying to work out if this was a joke, but seeing Maxime's seriousness, he knew it was not. The orcs. Charles blurted out, unable to hide his surprise. Maxime raised his hand, again imposing silence. Yes, the orcs. They've been ravaging the southern lands for years, and every winter their threat grows. This is our chance to prove, not just to ourselves, but to the whole kingdom, that we are a force to be feared. It's also an opportunity for us to make our fortune, recruit new comrades and improve our power to deal with the unexpected. Tenna, expecting a bold idea, couldn't help but let out a small sigh. The man's too crazy. But Maxime smiled this time, a confident smile full of determination. If we succeed, if we manage to intervene in the war and be one of the key elements in pushing back the orcs, the name of our group will echo in every tavern, every castle, every corner of the kingdom. I know it's dangerous, he resumed in a deeper voice. But there's no glory without risk. Some of the mercenaries nodded silently, others still looked worried, but no one dared to argue. They knew that Maxime didn't take this kind of decision lightly. And that's not all, he added, once again capturing the full attention of his men. Once this mission is accomplished, we'll be back here for another battle.
A much closer one.
But this time we'll be totally ready. This will be the decisive battle against Baron Barton.
Faces froze.
Baron Barton's name was synonymous with power and oppression in this region. Confronting his forces seemed an even greater challenge. Maxime continued, his voice now more determined than ever. This will be the decisive battle. Once we've finished in the south, we'll come back here, stronger, more numerous. And we'll destroy Bothan's forces. We'll put an end to his tyranny, and we'll take our place in history. The murmurs had turned into a palpable energy. Some mercenaries exchanged glances full of adrenaline and pride. Others remained silent, weighing up the magnitude of the battles ahead. But all understood that they were about to embark on something far greater than ordinary missions. So get some rest, concluded Maxime. The day after tomorrow, we're leaving. The heavy air of the clearing took on a new tension, an excitement mixed with worry. The fate of the battles to come was still uncertain, but one thing was certain: the mercenaries' destiny was about to change forever. Maxime stepped down from his wooden crate, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his mercenaries, who were slowly recovering from the shock announcement. Some were chatting amongst themselves, hesitating between enthusiasm and fear, while others were already sharpening their weapons. Laura walked alongside, arms crossed, watching her comrades with a pensive air. You've managed to motivate them, but you know that's only part of the problem. It takes more than determination to take on orcs, especially if they're outnumbered. Maxime nodded, his face now more serious.
Yes, I know.
But we still have a few days to prepare a real strategy. We're not going to rush in headlong. I'm going to meet a few scouts, see if there's any way of getting more information about their camp. We're not walking into a trap. Laura nodded, impressed by her leader's lucidity despite his usually carefree air. Okay, that's reassuring. The evening continued in a somewhat tense atmosphere, but fortunately for everyone, it ended quickly and everyone went to sleep. The next day, Laura and Maxime gathered in a small room of the new inn that temporarily served as a strategic meeting room for important discussions. We now need to know how many there are, how they move, and above all, where to strike to weaken them before they can strike back. As they continued to ponder their strategy, one of the young mercenaries entered the room, out of breath. Chief, a foreigner has just arrived. She claims to be an envoy from Baron Irit. She says it's urgent. Maxime and Laura exchanged glances. Should we expect a new problem? Asked Laura suspiciously. Maxime squinted. With Baron Irit, who knows? Send her in. The envoy entered the room, a young woman dressed in light armor, obviously traveling for several days judging by the dust that covered her clothes. She bowed quickly to Maxime and Laura. Maxime? Leader of the saber-toothed tigers. Maxime stepped forward resolutely.
That's me. The woman nodded.
I've come from Baron Irit. He sends me with some disturbing news. Maxime raised an eyebrow, approaching her curiously. Speak, what's on his mind?
Baron Barton. He's getting ready.
We've received reports that he's been building up his forces faster than expected. The attack on his territory could be imminent. She paused, glancing nervously at Maxime. Baron Irit asks you to be ready. He sees you as indispensable support against this threat. Maxime remained silent for a moment, thinking. Then he straightened up, his eyes sparkling with new resolve. Good. Tell the Baron he can count on us. But also inform him that we're not yet ready to act recklessly. If he wants us to be one of his bulwarks, he must give us time. The envoy nodded, relieved by this answer. I'll pass on your words to him. When the envoy left the room, Laura sighed heavily. Between the orcs and Baron Barton, we're in a hell of a fix. Maxime nodded contemplatively. Yes. But it's situations like this that forge legends. If we can get out of this, no one will be able to ignore us anymore.
Laura smiled.
Well, Maxime, I sincerely hope everything goes as you plan, because if it doesn't, we're all going to die very soon. Maxime remained silent, aware of the dangers he was taking on. On the other hand, most of his comrades were simply trying to survive in the world of eternity. Usually, they joined a famous mercenary group and went on simple escort missions. Although there was a slight risk involved, the rewards were well worth the effort to get off to a good start in eternity. Some tried to join the forces of certain nobles, preferably viscounts or counts, so as to be able to guarantee a degree of security while having plenty of resources to improve their skills. Moreover, the advantage was that if they unlocked the knighting talent, they might be able to practice a breathing method and thus have another method than the system to become stronger. The two methods were compatible and one didn't hinder the other. But all these methods could take years to achieve even the level of a knight. Even Maxime, who had a connection time of 2 months to eternity, 4 or even 8 times longer than most people, would need at least 2 or 3 years to obtain this level of strength. But here, by his second connection, Maxime was already approaching the strength level of a knight and had 100 powerful men under his command. But he knew he had achieved all this by relying on his talent and above all by being bold from the start. At the moment, his eyes were fixed on the map of the south spread out before him. Baron Irit's envoy had just left, and with her, Barthan's ominous shadow now hung over their camp. The wind outside was blowing harder, as if to indicate that the storm was approaching. Laura, at his side, watched him attentively, sensing the tension rising in her leader's mind. "So, what do we do, boss?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Maxime took a few seconds before answering. "We're not changing our plans. The orcs are a real threat. If we manage to beat them, it will give us not only fame, but also extra men. The nobles of the south will also come to us regularly to ask for protection. What's more, thanks to our future reputation, we'll have a strong flow of new recruits and resources." He stared at Laura, looking determined. "But to take on Barthan, we'll have to be very quick." Laura frowned, pondering her leader's words. "So, you want us to play on both fronts virtually at the same time?" Maxime nodded. "Yes. The key is timing. We need to hit the orcs, win a quick and decisive victory. Then we'll turn to Barthan." Laura crossed her arms, observing the map. "You realize we're flirting with disaster, right? If we fail against the orcs, Barthan could take the opportunity to crush us." Maxime smiled. "And that's precisely why we can't fail, that every step has to be calculated. And that's precisely why we can't fail, that every step must be carefully calculated." As they chatted, Ernest entered the tent, his bow strapped securely to his back. "Enjoy exclusive chapters from my virtual library empire." At his belt, a sheath housed his sword. Although he had made significant progress in the art of sword fighting, he wasn't ready to give up his bow. With it, he could accomplish things that the sword couldn't, and the bow held inestimable sentimental value for him. With a quick glance, he assessed Maxime and Laura. "You look preoccupied. Is something going on?" he asked matter-of-factly. Maxime looked up at him, a discreet smile on his lips. "Nothing to worry about. We're just getting ready to head south." Ernest frowned, a gleam of skepticism in his eyes. "Have you thought about the distance? How long a walk is that? Not to mention the strength of the orcs and what our allies can really bring." Maxime replied with a soothing smile, which allayed Ernest's concern a little. "Absolutely not," he said with a touch of irony. Ernest sighed deeply. "It's far too chaotic." He murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "We do have a plan though," Maxime replied, visibly more sure of himself. Laura and Ernest exchanged a glance, before staring again at Maxime, eager to listen attentively. Maxime, having obviously already thought everything through to the last detail, continued. "To begin with, we'll be taking only the elite with us. 20 men at most." Ernest nodded as Maxime continued. "The rest of the troops aren't ready yet. There's no point in sending them to the slaughterhouse when they can still make rapid progress with a little more training. Besides, in a vast battlefield like the one ahead of us, having too many people would only make us more visible to the enemy. We'd risk attracting them unnecessarily while slowing our progress." Maxime paused, glancing confidently at Laura and Ernest. "And there's another advantage to leaving our troops here." Laura frowned slightly, intrigued. Maxime continued in a calm but determined tone. "By leaving a garrison in Plauta, the village will remain protected. This way, Baron Barthan won't take the risk of launching a hasty attack if the village is still well guarded." He let a brief silence settle before concluding. "We can entrust the management of the situation to Killian in our absence. In the event of an attack, agile and hardy mercenaries will be able to quickly warn Knight Ron." Ernest remained silent for a moment before replying. "So be it, as long as you know what you're doing." As the conversation between Maxime, Ernest and Laura drew to a close, a slight noise was heard in the doorway. Ernest immediately turned his head, still on guard, while Maxime squinted, intrigued. The wooden door opened softly, revealing two familiar figures, Henry and Altia, two of Baron Irit's young apprentice knights. Maxime watched them curiously. "Henry, Altia, what are you doing here?" Henry, the first to step forward, held Maxime's gaze without flinching. "We've thought long and hard," he began, his voice full of determination. "And we've come to a decision. We want to join the saber-toothed tigers." Maxime crossed his arms, wary. "You want to leave Baron Irit to join us? You know that the life of a mercenary is far riskier than that of an apprentice knight. What drives you to make such a choice?" Altia, more reserved but just as determined, spoke up in turn. "We've seen what you can do. It's not just about fighting or battles." She stared at Maxime, her gaze piercing. "It's because of you, Maxime. We know you have a special talent. A talent that could make us stronger. Maxime raised an eyebrow slightly. My talent, he said, feigning surprise. Henry took another step forward, his eyes shining with ambition. We've seen with our own eyes ordinary people quickly become stronger just after joining your mercenary group. And we want to get stronger too. Ernest, who until then had been watching in silence, leaned forward slightly, intrigued. So you think Maxime can offer you more than Baron Irit?
Altia spoke up.
We've learned all we can in the Baron's service, and despite our titles as geniuses, we know that our talents will allow us at most to become knights, and even then, the odds are still against us. But Maxime, you and your group have something different. If we want to go beyond our limits, we feel this is the place to do it with you. Maxime remained silent for a moment, measuring their words. Laura, who had been watching the scene with growing interest, finally spoke up. You know it's not that simple. Just because you join our group doesn't mean you'll become stronger overnight. There's a price to pay, sacrifices to be made. Henry nodded without hesitation.
We know that.
But we're willing to do anything to go beyond our limits.
Altia added, her tone serious.
Baron Ira trained us, but he can't give us what you can. We've seen what you're capable of, and we want to fight alongside you. Maxime stared at them for a long moment, assessing their sincerity. The gleam of determination in their eyes was undeniable, but he knew this path wasn't for everyone. Being a mercenary, especially with the saber-toothed tigers, was more than just a career choice. It was a total commitment, a way of life where every decision could be a matter of life and death. Finally, Maxime took a deep breath and replied in a calm but firm tone.
Very well.
You want to join the saber-toothed tigers, but know one thing, my talent simply amplifies what you already have, so it doesn't create things out of nothing. Henry and Altia exchanged a knowing glance before replying in one voice. We're ready. Maxime thought again despite their words, stealing two promising young geniuses from Baron Irit was not something glorious. We might as well see their potential first, then make a decision, Maxime thought silently. Recruitment condition met, apprentice knights Henry and Altia have expressed a wish to join the mercenary group, the Saber-Tooth Tigers. Do you wish to accept them?
Yes.
The apprentice knights Henry and Altia have been successfully recruited. You can view their profiles at any time. Show me their physique, their talent, and above all their potential.
Henry, 4-star potential. Weak knightly talent. Physical, 2.1. Altia, 4-star potential. Weak knightly talent. Physical, 2.1. Pardon.
Maxime suddenly stood up in surprise, drawing all eyes to him. Impossible, it's impossible that they have 4-star potential. Simultaneously Henry and Altia looked at each other doubtfully, sensing that something had changed deep inside them. Maxime, what's wrong? Asked Laura with doubt clearly visible on her face. Maxime ignored her completely, calmed down and plunged into his thoughts. In terms of probability, it's almost impossible to find a 3-star talent other than Charles in the area. Nor do I seem to have heard that Henry and Altia had better strength than other children of the same age when they were small. Then why? He'd never heard of such a thing in class. Then Maxime suddenly thought of something. Could the knighting talent modify the mercenary talent to some extent? Or rather, does the mercenary talent automatically adapt to the person's physique? No, otherwise Romuald would also have 3-star potential since he's exceeded the limits. But the breathing method is ultimately something that can be considered extraordinary. Perhaps the very principle of the breathing method is to improve potential. Maxime seemed to have touched on something he should never have known. But he was excited by this discovery. So all apprentice knights must have 3-star potential. And more importantly, that would mean that a knight would then have 4-star potential, and if I managed to recruit him, then he would have 5-star potential?
5 stars.
Maxime's eyes were full of stars. It seemed that his talent was surprisingly compatible with this world. Why are you reacting like this, Maxime? Asked Ernest, his tone tinged with concern. Maxime gasped slightly, brought back to reality by his friend's question. He turned his head and saw Ernest and Laura staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. But even as he met their gazes, his mind remained cluttered with questions. Henry, Altia, can you practice the breathing method and tell me if there are any changes? The two young apprentice knights awoke too, being busy feeling the changes deep in their genes.
Yes, of course.
The two then began to make a few slow movements, then speeding up suddenly before gradually slowing down again. Their breathing was also strange, obviously quite different from that of an ordinary person. It was as if there was an incomprehensible rhythm to it. As they did so, Henry and Altia's faces became increasingly shocked. It's okay, you can stop now. Can you tell us exactly what the changes are? The two looked at each other, then seeming to feel the same, Henry spoke up. It seems that the breathing method has become totally ineffective. Maxime's eyes sparkled. That's exactly what I thought. And I was wrong all along. Ernest and Laura were confused, but everyone was curious. What exactly is going on, Maxime? Asked Laura, her eyebrows furrowed. Well, I think what I'm about to say will still have some omissions, but as I understand it, the breathing method is about gradually changing your potential while improving your physique passively through effort. Normally what you feel, Henry and Altia, and why the breathing method tires a lot, is because it literally transforms your potential to make it stronger. Similarly, every time, the satisfaction and pain you have during and after your workouts is almost exclusively related to improving your potential. The importance of physical strengthening is in the minority when practicing the breathing method. This discovery also disappointed Maxime a little, as he thought he'd obtained a method for improving his physical strength without going through the system. But having the nightly talent also meant being able to awaken the vital seed at the nightly stage, and thus be able to exercise the powers associated with it. Indeed, a knight could almost be said to be disabled if he could no longer use his vital seed. Now, my talent consists in improving the potential of any individual joining my mercenary group by one level. Which means your potential has already met the standards for becoming a knight. The excitement in Altia and Henry's eyes could be seen. We can become knights at any time then? Maxime shook his head. Not exactly. You've only fulfilled the fundamental condition for becoming a knight. To awaken the vital seed and become a knight, you still lack at least 0.9 points of physicality as well as the opportunity to awaken it. Indeed, once potential and physique had been achieved, it took powerful excitement, usually triggered in life or death battles, or through expensive potions for the vital seed to awaken and fully form. Henry and Altia calmed down a little. They themselves knew far more than Maxime about the conditions for becoming a knight, but the excitement had clouded their judgment. However, they were now extremely optimistic. If before they'd only had a slim chance of becoming knights, and even then it was at least 10 years of training or more, now they were confident of becoming knights in less than a year. Indeed, joining this mercenary group is the opportunity of a lifetime. Henry's thoughts were similar to Altia's. Why did you hesitate so long? Because of my hesitation we've lost so much time. Henry had a slightly bitter taste in his mouth knowing this. And thinking about how he defended Maxime in the past with his arrogance, he felt like smashing his skull into a wall. He could have ruined the chance of a lifetime just because of his ego. Maxime also warned them as usual. The chance you had today must remain discreet so that my talent is not known to all. What's more, I have great control over this part of my talent. At any time, if you wish to leave the mercenary group, if you make an irreparable mistake or if you betray the group, I will directly take away what I have given you today. You'll also lose all the progress that's been made thanks to the blessing of my talent. In practical terms, this would return you to a physical strength similar to today's. If the circumstances are particularly grave, your head will also be drawn on several supports and then your face will be shown to all our mercenaries. You will then be hunted down by all the saber-toothed tigers until your death is confirmed. Henry and Altia shuddered. In their early days, saber-toothed tigers were already so strong, so in the future they could already imagine that if they did anything wrong, they might be hunted down by countless mercenaries as powerful as knights, or even stronger. Hearing all this, Henry made himself a promise. From now on I'll keep my head down forever in front of him and I'll never cause trouble in the group. For her part, Altia wasn't too worried by Maxime's words and simply nodded in response. She knew she wouldn't do anything to lose this opportunity. The speech over, Maxime smiled again. Welcome to the saber-toothed tigers. Ernest and Laura smiled back. I hope to be able to entrust you with my back on the battlefields. I'll also assist you as best I can, added Ernest, while touching his girdle. You will undoubtedly become the pillars of the mercenary group in no time. When that happens I hope to be able to count on you, continued Laura, as she lightly combed back her hair. Henry blushed slightly. It had to be said that Laura's charm might even make her one of the most beautiful women in the kingdom. But Henry quickly suppressed his thoughts, realizing how dangerous the situation could be for him if he fell under Laura's spell. Without a doubt, coveting the chief's wife was synonymous with courting death. Question like that, but do you think Baron Irit might let me learn his breathing method? Asked Maxime without too much expectation. The breathing method is the foundation of a noble family, it's not so easily transmitted, replied Altia, shaking her head. Henry disagreed. I think Baron Irit might make an exception if we manage to defeat Baron Barton, and in exchange for some benefits or promises. Well, we'll see, concluded Maxime without much conviction. Henry looked quickly at Altia before taking a step forward as he assumed a more serious expression. Besides, we came here for another reason. Everyone looked at Henry, who had taken on a very serious expression. Baron Irat's scouts have reported that the first lines of battle against the orcs are only 3 days' march to the south. The orcs are already gaining ground, and there are sporadic clashes. If you leave now, you'll reach the front lines just in time to reinforce the allied troops. Maxime crossed his arms, pondering this new information. The orcs were a growing danger, and the situation seemed more urgent than expected. He turned to Laura and Ernest, seeking their advice with his eyes. They nodded in silent approval. We're not changing our plans, we're still leaving tomorrow, replied Maxime rather dryly. These cold words cooled Altia and Henry's spirit slightly. They wanted to reply, but suddenly remembered that the man in front of them, who was also their age, was now their leader. But Maxime quickly explained a few things so they could understand their new identity. Mercenaries are not knights, we only act for money and to get stronger so we can survive longer and make even more money. Intervening when people really need help adds enormous value to our intervention while putting our men at less risk. Find adventures at my virtual library empire. Henry and Altia looked at each other, confused. All their lives, they'd been raised on chivalric virtues. But today, they were embarking on a very different path. Yet one thing was certain, they would not go back. Maxime watched the silence settle in, his new companions visibly torn between their knightly training and the harsh reality of the mercenary world. He knew this transition would be difficult for them, but he had no time to lose in convincing them further. Their looks, though troubled, showed a newfound determination. You'll get used to it, Maxime added, his voice reassuring. This world demands more than ideals. Ernest then approached the 2 young apprentices, placing a firm hand on Henry's shoulder. Don't worry, mercenaries have a code too, even if it's different from that of knights. Just because we fight for gold doesn't mean we don't have values. Altia nodded, though her gaze remained pensive. She had always dreamed of becoming a knight, protecting the weak and honoring her family. But today, she found herself having to reevaluate what that really meant. Strength, survival, loyalty to the group. These notions were suddenly taking on greater importance. Let's end the meeting here, we absolutely must be prepared to leave first thing in the morning, Laura added, breaking the silence. And if the orcs manage to break through, it won't just be a problem for the nobles, but for everyone. Maxime turned to Laura, nodding. The battle against the orcs is important, but first we have to make sure our group is well prepared. If we're weak, we won't be of any use over there. Ernest nodded, turning away to camp business. Then we might as well get some rest. Tomorrow it all begins. As they dispersed to prepare their gear and think about the day ahead, Henry approached Maxime discreetly. His face was grave, but he seemed to have made up his mind. Maxime, I owe you an apology for what happened before. I was arrogant, and I underestimated the importance of what you offer us. Thank you for letting me stay. I won't let you down. Maxime laid a hand on Henry's shoulder, a slight smile on his lips. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them. Don't worry, you still have time to prove your worth. The two exchanged a look of understanding before Henry returned to his business. Maxime followed him with pensive eyes. He knew Henry and Altia were promising recruits, but he still wondered how much their loyalty would be tested in the days ahead. The war against the orcs was only the beginning. In the shadows, other forces were preparing to enter the fray, forces more subtle and dangerous than the brutal hordes of the south. Under the starry sky, the tents of the camp were immersed in a peaceful silence, but Maxime couldn't sleep. Sitting by the dying fire, he watched the flickering flames, lost in thought. The shadow of decisions to be made weighed heavily on him. Despite the day's success, he knew that every step they took in the days ahead would be crucial to their survival. You should get some sleep, you know. The soft voice, tinged with irony, broke the silence around him. Maxime turned his head slightly to see Laura, the former bandit, approaching with her feline gait. Her slim, lithe body stood out in the firelight, and her hair cascading around her face added to the mysterious aura she always carried with her. You're not asleep either, Maxime replied with a slight smile, well aware of the effect Laura could have on him, as on the others. She shrugged, then sat down opposite him, her gaze scanning the fire. I'm used to sleepless nights. The bandit life, remember. Maxime looked at her, wondering whether she was joking or serious. Their relationship had always been ambiguous. Laura was strong, formidable even, but she had this way of hiding her true intentions behind smiles and words he could never fully decipher. Ever since she joined the group, there'd been a palpable tension between them that was both electrifying and frustrating. "I remember that," he replied at last. "But it's been a while since you were what you used to be. You're different now." Laura smiled, a smile that revealed nothing, but suggested everything. "What about you, Maxime? You're different too. Just a few months ago, you were just a boy lost in this strange world. Now you're the leader of a group of mercenaries who are numerous and powerful. How do you like having this power?" He stared at her for a moment, wondering what she was getting at. Laura always knew where to press to make him think, sometimes even to destabilize him. Through their old discussions, she already knew many things about him. Not least that this wasn't the world he'd been born into. "It's not a question of pleasure. I do what I have to do." He looked away, watching the embers. "If I don't do it, who will do it for me?" She nodded slowly, seeming to appreciate the answer. "Always so serious." She murmured. "But I wonder, Maxime, how far are you willing to go to keep this power? Do you care about the lives of your mercenaries?" The question was direct, almost a challenge. Maxime looked up at her again. He knew Laura wasn't afraid to ask the tough questions, the ones others avoided. Their relationship was built on these intellectual and emotional confrontations. He appreciated her for it, even if it often troubled him. "As far as it takes," he said after a moment's silence. "As long as I have the power, I won't let anything or anyone threaten this group." Laura leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting in the light of the dying flames. "Even if it means doing things you hate? That you never thought you'd be able to do?" He felt the tension in her words, the weight of what she was saying. Maxime knew Laura was speaking from experience. As a former bandit, she'd no doubt already been through these moral dilemmas, these moments when you had to choose between your integrity and survival. "Yes," he replied firmly. "Even that." Laura stared at him for a moment, her eyes searching for something in his, as if she wanted to make sure of his sincerity. Then she smiled, but this time it was a sad, almost resigned smile. "That's what I wanted to hear," she murmured. She stepped back slightly, breaking the closeness that enveloped them, but the tension between them was still there. However, Maxime sensed a mysterious sadness emanating from Laura. It was as if she were hiding a part of her life from him, a part that would have left a deep impression on him. "But don't forget, Maxime. The further you get from who you were, the more you risk losing yourself. And once you're too far away, you never go back." Maxime looked at her intently. "You think I'm going to lose myself, Laura?" She shrugged, her gaze becoming more distant. "I don't know. Maybe you're stronger than me. Maybe you're stronger than me. Or maybe you're already losing yourself, and you don't even realize it." Silence settled between them again, heavy with unspoken words. Laura finally stood up, as if the conversation were over, but before walking away, she turned to him one last time. "You know where to find me if you want to talk, or if you need anything else." Her tone was ambiguous, implying much more than mere words. Maxime watched her leave, a strange feeling weighing on his chest. He knew Laura was right in a way. The power, the responsibility, it all came at a cost. But he hadn't yet discovered how much he was willing to pay. In the early hours of the morning, Maxime was up before the others, watching the sunrise with a strange serenity. He sensed that something great was afoot, something that would turn their world upside down and throw him and his companions into a storm greater than they had ever imagined. Read latest chapters at my virtual library empire. He clenched his fists. Whatever happened, he was ready to face this uncertain future. He clenched his fists. Whatever happened, he was ready to face this uncertain future. The timid light of dawn tinted the hills a golden hue. The time had come. Today, he and a score of his men would head south, leaving behind the soldiers, the village and its inhabitants, as well as a large number of saber-toothed tigers. Outside, activity was just beginning to pick up. The first mercenaries, their hair still in disarray, were starting to get ready, and villagers were coming and going between the rudimentary wooden houses. Baron Irat's well-organized soldiers were already up and training, led by Killian, who looked very serious. He was standing shirtless. Several menacing scars, some from Aurak, could be seen on his torso. But in this world, instead of being repulsive, they glorified Killian's body. As if he looked more intimidating than he originally did. Maxime nodded and waved to a few new mercenaries nearby. The latter immediately understood the order, and quickly moved towards Andrew, Romuald, Laura, Ernest, Rodrigo, Terry, James, Pietro, Izo, Tenna and his brothers, Charles, Henry, Altia and 5 other powerful mercenaries, telling them to get ready to leave. Meanwhile, Maxime headed for Killian. Killian, Maxime called as he approached. The apprentice knight at the stage of great success turned his head and greeted him with a respectful nod. Maxime, up and about already? The world belongs to the men who get up early, Maxime replied with a half-smile. Killian raised an eyebrow in surprise, then laughed lightly. I guess that's true. Maxime quickly switched to a more serious tone. I'm counting on you to look after the village in our absence. You're now the most important bulwark against Baron Barton if he decides to attack. Killian nodded gravely. Don't worry. As long as I'm here, Plauta won't fall. Maxime thanked him with a look, satisfied with this assurance. He would have liked to take more men with him, but Killian alone wasn't enough. He needed many men to help him in battle. Given enough time, new recruits to the saber-toothed tigers will quickly acquire a physique comparable to that of an elite soldier. Combined with the teachings of an apprentice knight like Killian, they would form a small but powerful elite army. It was also the least Maxime could do. After all, he was paid to defend the village, not to leave just a few men here to go off and fight orcs. Simultaneously, Andrew, looking serious despite the early hour, arrived at Maxime and Killian's side and handed them a cup of steaming tea. Ready to go? Asked Andrew, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. His eyes showed that he was thirsty for new adventures and challenges. Maxime took the cup gratefully and nodded, while Killian refused with a shake of his head. Andrew shrugged, showing that he didn't care. Seeing Laura arrive, he handed her the remaining cup of tea, still steaming. Simultaneously, Maxime smiled at her in greeting, and she replied in kind. Thank you, Andrew. Laura looked kindly at Andrew, but the latter seemed immune to her charm. On the contrary, probably having fought against her in the former bandits' base, he considered her a pair. He also knew that currently, no one but Maxime could beat her without risking his life. Maxime glanced at Andrew. Yeah, everything's ready, and you, is everything in order? Andrew nodded. The men who stay here have been briefed. Tenna and Laura have checked the supplies, everything's in place. As for those leaving with us, they're ready. Laura spoke up in turn, her expression serious. We've got 24 hours provisions for the trip, but the men know we can find something to hunt on the way if need be. No logistical problems to report. Maxime smiled inwardly. They made a good team. Every detail was already thought out, anticipated. Good. We leave in an hour. Get the men ready, Maxime ordered as he finished his tea. An hour later, the camp was abuzz with activity. Weapons carefully inspected and adjusted. The group of mercenaries leaving with Maxime gathered in the center of the village, ready to go. There was a palpable mix of excitement and nervousness among them. Some were adjusting their protective gear, others checking their blades one last time. Maxime took one last look at the 80 mercenaries remaining in Plauta. He raised his hand and addressed them in a strong voice. I'm counting on you to protect this village. You know the orders. Hold out until we return, and make sure Barton regrets it if he decides to come closer. Yes, sir. The mercenaries were loyal, at least as long as they were paid, and Maxime had made sure that their wages would be paid, even in his absence. In any case, he wasn't worried. His talent was the best means of controlling his mercenaries. No one could bear to lose the opportunity to become a powerful man. This dream was all the more magnified when the individual had been weak all his life. Maxime exchanged one last glance with the mercenaries accompanying him. They all looked fierce and powerful, and so they were. Even the weakest of them could compete, for a short time, with an apprentice knight at the entrance stage. Then he turned south, to where the roads would take them. Forward! He shouted loudly. The 20 mercenaries set off, followed by the gaze of the villagers and mercenaries left behind. 3 days of walking followed, punctuated by discussions and the monotony of the journey. The group advanced at a good pace, crossing dense forests, peaceful valleys and winding rivers. On this third day, as the sun declined over the horizon, Andrew and Charles walked side by side. Everyone was talking except them. After a while, it was Andrew who broke the silence. So, Charles, ready for your first real mission? He asked in a husky voice, without taking his eyes off the road. In the space of a few months, Andrew had grown in maturity and aura. Just by walking the way he did, some might think he'd been fighting all his life. No one would guess that only a few months before, he'd been a simple villager who'd lost his family to bandits. Charles straightened a little in his saddle, trying to hide the tension that knotted his shoulders. He knew he had talent, but being under Andrew's gaze made him nervous. As much as possible. He replied in what he hoped was a confident tone. I'm not here to make up the numbers. Andrew chuckled softly, a note of amused contempt in his voice. That's what all the newbies say. talent's all well and good, but it won't save your hide when a blade's ready to slit your throat. Charles glanced at Andrew, noticing the coldness in his eyes. He knew the man had far more courage than he could, it turns out, ever have. "You don't think I'll last?" asked Charles, a hint of defiance in his voice. Andrew shrugged, indifferent. "It's not for me to judge. You could be the son of an earl or just a poor fellow with a bit of luck, it doesn't matter to me. What I want to see is how you react when you've got an enemy's blood on your hands." There was a tense silence. Charles understood the message behind these words. It wasn't a question of talent or potential. Here, in this group of mercenaries, only the blood spilled in battle spoke for them. Charles didn't answer, but he knew that this mission was his trial by fire. And whatever happened, he would prove to Andrew, Maxime and himself that he deserved his place among them. Further ahead, Romuald, who was walking close to Maxime, wanted to know more. After all, only a few knew what was going to happen. "Maxime, it's already the 3rd day, could you explain the situation in the south? Who are the nobles involved?" As their troop was small, everyone interrupted the ongoing discussions and concentrated on what was about to be said. This information was vitally important, and everyone knew it. "Stay updated with my virtual library empire." Maxime took a deep breath before answering, his eyes scanning the horizon as if gathering his thoughts. The south is a fragmented region. There are several noble houses, but the most powerful is unquestionably that of Count Arden, master of the county of Ravemont. His territory is vast and well defended, stretching from the hills of Endriel to the forest of Myra. Everyone knew the Endriel hills, for they were reputed to be the first line of defense against the orcs. For if the orcs wanted to attack the kingdom's territory, they were obliged to pass through these hills. For its part, the Myra forest was known for the legends linked to it. It was said that in the past, there was nothing there but dead, uncultivable land. But after the death of a woman, considered by legend to be a goddess, trees grew rapidly, insects appeared and animals began to live there. This woman's name, according to legend, was Myra. Maxime resumed his speech. "The county of Ravemont is a natural fortress. Arden is an ambitious man, an outstanding strategist, and his army is the most disciplined in the region. He has over 20,000 regular soldiers under his command, dozens of powerful knights as well as a small but formidable heavy cavalry." "And the other nobles?" asked Romuald. "Are they all allied to him, or are there divisions?" Maxime nodded. "Arden has allies, of course, but they're not very reliable. Some petty lords are loyal to him more out of fear than conviction. But there are tensions too. Count Arden dominates, but other, smaller nobles, like Baron Raulf de Ventel or Viscountess Elda de Mirande, are unhappy with his influence. Raulf in particular has lost several lands because of Arden's decisions, and Elda, for her part, is always looking to expand her own domain, in order to become countess. These rivalries complicate the situation." Romuald frowned, weighing these words. "So, who are we going to help first against the orcs?" he asked. "Arden? Or another nobleman?" "I think it's best to lend a hand to the noble family of Algrand," said Maxime. "Why this territory in priority?" asked Romuald curiously. "Their lord Baron Edrin is only an apprentice knight at the peak stage, and he's poorly equipped to deal with a threat like the orcs. His forces are very weak with less than 500 regular soldiers and only a few apprentice knights." Romuald quickly understood. Since they're weak, they're both the most likely to fall quickly but also the easiest to help. Our elite force could really change the situation on a small battlefield like this. Maxime nodded at Romuald's thought, and at the same time added an important element. His territory should have excellent revenues, but strangely his army is so small. In any case, he shouldn't be spending a lot of gold on this aspect. Generally, that means the Lord likes to have gold to spare and so they can pay us well. If it turns out that he was just a greedy lord, we'll see if he's still greedy after having a sword under his neck. As he said all this, Maxime wore an imperturbable expression, as if he were talking about the errands he was going to run the next day. But Romuald looked very worried, as did several other mercenaries listening in on the conversation. "If the news that our group has threatened a nobleman reaches the ears of the kingdom's court, we could be beheaded." Maxime suddenly stopped and looked at Romuald. A heavy atmosphere settled over the forest where they were walking. Only the sound of a few birds and the wind whistling through the leaves could be heard. "If for you the mercenary life means being paid a pittance and bowing to every nobleman you come across, then you haven't yet understood the mentality of our mercenary group." Maxime took one last look at the other mercenaries, then turned and walked on as if nothing had happened. No one dared reply to Maxime on the subject. They all knew it was for their own good that they had to act in this way. "What's our plan?" questioned Terry, who had been listening intently all along. From what I understand, it's difficult to repel orcs in open terrain. Discover more stories at my virtual library empire. Maxime's voice became more solemn. Algrand is a small fortress town perched on a hill to the east of Ravemont, not far from the Endriel Hills. It's an advantageous defensive position, but according to the latest reports, orcs have already crossed the mountains and are harassing the villages affiliated with the town. Our first mission is to strengthen its defenses. We also need to understand the scale of the opposing army. If it's just an isolated raid, we can repel them. But if it's a more organized orc army, that's another matter. Terry nodded, understanding the wisdom of his words. The road still stretched before them, and in the distance it was possible to make out the first hills marking the entrance to the southern lands. As the group made their way along the steep paths, an acrid smell of smoke carried on the wind reached them. Maxime, alerted, raised a hand to immobilize the troop. They scanned the surrounding hills, and a dark cloud hovered at the edge of the forest to the north, where the village of Ventbois lay, a village supposedly under Algrand's protection. A village in the distance is in flames, Andrew announced, squinting, his voice tinged with seriousness. He turned a questioning gaze to Maxime, wondering what action they should take next. Forward. If they're under attack, we need to act fast. The troop quickened its pace, rolling down the hill and following the smoke to the outskirts of the village. Wrenching cries echoed through the air, and they soon saw a horrific scene. Houses had been set on fire, villagers were trying to flee, while some 30 orcs were spreading terror, happily pursuing the defenseless villagers. Their only defense was their green skin, but they all held a variety of rather large weapons. Their racial peculiarity gave them a physique particularly focused on robustness, then strength and finally speed. It should be noted that even a teenage orc could have the strength of an elite soldier, while most adult orcs could reach the strength of an apprentice knight at the entry stage. However, their agility and army coordination was poor, allowing humans to hold the line against them and even win most battles. Here, only a few brave men tried to confront the orcs, but they were quickly slaughtered one after the other due to the orcs' powerful natural strength. If ordinary humans attacked orcs without proper equipment and strategy, they were courting death. Without a doubt, this village of 200 to 300 inhabitants would soon be massacred without the intervention of Maxime and his men. Romuald, take 5 men and block the north exit. The rest with me. We attack from the east, ordered Maxime, drawing his sword. The troop deployed without hesitation, every man and woman knowing what they had to do.
Yes, Chief.
Tenna and his brothers and Terry accompanied Romuald to the north, while the rest continued to follow Maxime. Maxime soon reached the wooden wall to the east of the village, which had been completely destroyed by the orcs. From his vantage point, he could see that in the center of the village, an orc, taller and more massive than the others, dominated the scene. A huge axe, with twisted blades covered in dried blood, hung from his belt. He made strange noises to control his men. But this orc was a little too far away, and right now it was more important to save the villagers nearby. Maxime nodded to his men, and the 14 accompanying mercenaries jumped onto the roofs of the houses like martial arts experts with superhuman physiques to gain better visibility. Then, in teams of 2 to 3, they quickly surrounded several intrepid orcs and killed them. Others were powerful enough to easily defeat an orc in 1 versus 1. With a war cry, Maxime leapt up and struck an orc in the flank with a precise blow that pierced its green skin. The orc let out a hoarse howl before collapsing heavily. Ernest, standing on the roof of a house, unhooked his bow from his back, aimed at an orc about to lay waste to a house, then shot an arrow straight into its eye. As the orc cried out in pain, covering his eye with his left hand, Ernest rushed towards him and decapitated him directly. For his part, Henry managed to knock down an orc by knocking him off balance with his shield and then piercing his mouth with his sword. The surprise worked in their favor, and in less than a minute they had already eliminated a dozen orcs. The villagers, who until then had been running around in panic and shouting, began to calm down and watched in amazement as the mercenaries tore through the small orc squad. They were attracted by the impressive sight of these men coming to their rescue. Comments and exclamations erupted, betraying their disbelief. "Great, Baron Edrin's men have arrived?" "Impossible, I've seen Baron Edrin's soldiers fight before and none of them could survive for a single second against the might of these people." "I agree, these guys are completely inhuman." A young boy pointed at Andrew, who was splitting the air with his sword. "Look, Mom, the gentleman jumped at least 10 feet. Other villagers also saw the scene. "Damn, that guy literally flies." "Clearly. It's not human to jump 3 meters high like that." Not far away, the orc leader spotted the agitation and surprise of his own troops. He roared in a ferocious voice, raising his axe high as a rallying cry. His red eyes, gleaming with rage, landed on Maxime, whom he pointed to. In an instant, 15 orcs, galvanized by their leader, converged on the mercenaries in a furious charge. Maxime signaled to Andrew, Laura, Ernest, Rodrigo, James, Pietro, Izo, Charles, Henry, Altia and the remaining mercenaries. You take care of the weaker ones, I'll take care of this monster here. The few remaining orcs were fighting in the north of the village with Romuald, Terry, Tenna and his 2 brothers. The latter's every step shook the ground, and his axe arced menacingly through the air, ready to descend on the head mercenary. The giant orc swept the air with a powerful blow. Maxime barely dodged, feeling the breath of the axe cleaving the air near his face. He knew he couldn't match the brute strength of this creature. He decided to exploit his agility, circling the orc leader, analyzing his movements. As he dodged, the house behind him was completely destroyed by the orc's powerful blow. A few cries of distress echoed through the house, but Maxime couldn't deal with them at the moment. The orc continued to swing his axe in Maxime's direction, but only succeeded in destroying the surroundings, without touching the human he was aiming at. With a grunt, the orc changed strategy and feinted to the right before delivering a violent diagonal blow. This time, Maxime couldn't dodge completely, and the axe blade grazed his arm, tearing his armor and leaving a bloody gash. "TCH, this orc has at least the power of a knight," Maxime murmured, looking at the imposing orc in front of him. But he had agility on his side and continued to fight the orc with his flexibility, wounding him slightly. He was very careful, because if he was hit again, he could be seriously wounded and thus be at the mercy of the orc. While Maxime engaged the orc leader, the other mercenaries had already thrown themselves into the fray to protect the villagers and repel the orcs who were wreaking havoc all around them. The village square was transformed into a veritable battlefield, with each mercenary engaged in a relentless struggle. Andrew, the young man with the flaming red hair, rushed into the fray, his sword drawn and ready to slice. His movements were swift and precise, and his sword sliced through the air with frightening efficiency. An orc attacked him from the left, swinging a club with a furious snarl. Andrew ducked and ducked under the blow, then in one fluid motion, straightened up and thrust his blade into the creature's side, which collapsed with a howl. No sooner had he withdrawn his blade than another orc lunged at him, but Andrew met it with a blow to the chest, pushing it back with a powerful swing of his sword. A few yards away, Ernest, the young blue-haired archer, positioned himself high on the roof of a ruined barn. His arrows whistled through the air, striking their target with deadly accuracy. His next arrow pierced the eye of an orc trying to surprise Rodrigo from behind. His next arrow pierced the throat of another, preventing the creature from reaching a fleeing village girl. Rodrigo, the brown-haired young man with the imposing build, was fighting an orc head-on. The orc struck Rodrigo on the shoulder with a heavy sword, but to the orc's surprise, the blade of his usually sharp sword made a strange noise and bounced off Rodrigo's skin. A thin layer of broken rock could be seen. Taking advantage of his opponent's surprise, Rodrigo counterattacked, his axe slamming down hard on the orc's skull, causing him to collapse heavily. Rodrigo then turned to another enemy and raised his left arm, which had just been covered in rock, to protect himself from a blow. As the battle intensified, an elegant, graceful figure appeared in the midst of the fighting. Laura stood there, her piercing gaze scanning the battlefield with calm determination. Her entrance did not go unnoticed, and the orcs who crossed her path were immediately drawn to her. Her beauty transcended the scene, but what was even more striking was the intimidating aura she naturally exuded when holding a sword. She wielded a long, slender sword with exceptional mastery. With a fluid, calculated gesture, she dashed into the fray, striking with frightening precision. Her blade seemed to dance around her, tracing sparkling arcs in the air. Every movement was precise, every blow delivered with an elegance that contrasted with the brutality of the orc's assaults. She pivoted gracefully, avoiding a brutal attack from an orc who was trying to take her by surprise. Her blade split the air in a precise movement, piercing the orc who collapsed to the ground without a shout. Maxime, watching the battle unfold, nodded to Laura as he continued to restrain the orc leader. She understood immediately and moved to his side. Their synchronization was perfect. Maxime feinted and circled, and Laura nimbly sliced through the gaps Maxime created in the orc's defense. "Together we'll get there faster," she breathed as she passed by him, her eyes glowing with battle fire. The orc leader, cornered and enraged, tried to repel them with violent blows, but Laura and Maxime dodged with perfect harmony, instinctively adapting to each other's movements. Maxime could soon see the moment of weakness he had been waiting for. The chef was becoming increasingly angry, his blows more chaotic and powerful, but less precise. Maxime, seeing an opening, launched himself to deliver the final blow. But suddenly, the orc leader shouted a hoarse command, and suddenly 3 orcs who were occupied by a few mercenaries suddenly charged in his direction at the cost of many wounds. In a direct charge like this, It was difficult for Terry, Izo and Pietro, who were fighting them, to catch up easily. Andrew, seeing the orcs converging on Maxime and Laura, rushed forward without hesitation. He thrust his sword into the back of one of the green-skinned monsters, bringing it to its knees. Read new chapters at my virtual library empire. Ernest, still aloft, unleashed a swift arrow that whistled through the air and hit another orc, stopping him dead in his tracks. Terry, Izo and Pietro caught up with this one and took advantage of the opportunity to finish him off. Charles, fighting nearby, spotted the last orc rushing towards Maxime. He hesitated for a moment, then finally stepped in and used his body to face the sheer power of the orc. Unfortunately, he was too weak and was sent flying into a house while spitting out a mouthful of blood. The house collapsed on Charles, his life and death unknown. But he gained a few precious seconds for Andrew and Ernest, who joined forces to hold back the last orc and then kill him. Maxime remained focused on the orc leader, who now seemed finally weakened by his wounds and his own exhaustion. With a swift, decisive blow, Maxime drove his sword deep into the orc's chest. The giant creature flinched, reaching for Maxime with a trembling hand, but Laura came up from behind and drove her sword into the orc's chest too, before quickly withdrawing it. The orc leader howled in pain, staggered and finally collapsed. The two stood back, watching as their opponent collapsed heavily to the ground. 30 seconds later, all the orcs had been wiped out and the battle was over. Indeed, his men could now easily be considered the elite of the elite among ordinary humans. Some 30 adult orcs were easily exterminated without casualties, only a few mercenaries slightly wounded and Charles, whose situation was still unknown. As the last orc fell, silence fell. The villagers, at first terrified, dared to emerge from their hiding places, looking at their rescuers with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Maxime blew slightly to calm his breathing, then exchanged glances with Andrew, Ernest, Rodrigo, Laura and the rest of the mercenaries, each of them still alert despite the absence of new enemies. Not arguing with the villagers, Maxime and Laura went straight to Charles's condition. The warrior lay under a pile of wooden stones, the remains of the house that had collapsed on him. Maxime and Laura quickly headed for the rubble, Maxime being particularly worried. A mercenary with 4-star potential, it would hurt his heart to lose just one at this stage. Even more so when he possessed such an astonishing and rare talent. One had to imagine that, generally speaking, those who had 4-star mercenaries under their command had at least 5 years' experience in eternity, in addition to being very powerful both in terms of personal strength but also in terms of political power. Of course, most leaders of men in the real world didn't rely on mercenary potential to make their men stronger. Instead, they directly recruited apprentice knights and even more powerful individuals. The vast majority didn't train troops for the simple reason that it took too long to turn an ordinary person into a powerful individual. But more on that later. Laura, noticing Maxime's concern, felt her heart warm slightly. The usually arrogant Maxime with the powerful aura could have such an expression, she thought silently. Then she reassured him with a gentle, "We'll get him out of there, Maxime. I'm sure he's only injured, but he already has a powerful physique compared to an ordinary person, so he'll recover quickly." Maxime, his face tense, nodded silently and set about moving the stones and pieces of wood with Laura. Eventually, they saw Charles's torso, unusually deep as if a crevasse had formed while blood poured out of many places. But he was still breathing, albeit with difficulty. A faint smile stretched across his lips as he caught sight of their faces. "I didn't expect my first battle to end this way." His voice was almost a fragmented whisper. Maxime was reassured and laughed lightly as he heard what Charles was saying. "Did you see that? Mercenary life's great, isn't it?" Charles smiled with difficulty in response. Laura laid a hand lightly on his shoulder, her gaze more tender than usual. "You'll get off easy, don't worry. I don't doubt it, my career is just beginning." Several villagers came over. Totally ignoring Maxime and Laura, an elderly woman in a brown dress watched Charles with a frown. 2 adult men accompanied her, holding baskets filled with herbs. Maxime and Laura exchanged puzzled glances as they watched the old woman approach with 2 men. The old woman, with her weathered face and piercing eyes, inspected Charles's wounds without a word, then turned a sharp gaze on Maxime. "This young man is lucky to be alive. Move over and leave it to me." Maxime hesitated, instinctively defensive, but Laura whispered softly, "Let her do it, she seems to have some medical knowledge." Look at the villagers standing behind, they obviously have a lot of respect for this old woman. After our actions, there's no way they mean us any harm. Nodding his head, Maxime stepped back slightly, keeping a watchful eye on the old healer's every move. From one of the baskets held by the other men, she took out several dark green and pale blue herbs. Then she expertly crushed them between two stones she had brought with her, until she obtained a thick paste which she applied to Charles's wounds. She motioned to one of her assistants to apply a clean cloth to Charles's wounds to help stop the blood leaking out. Charles, though still weak, seemed to regain some color. He murmured a barely audible thank you. The healer didn't reply, absorbed in her work. Meanwhile, a few mercenaries had approached Maxime and Laura, while others were chatting with the villagers. The old woman ignored all this, looking after Charles. After a while, she turned to Maxime, who was listening with rapt attention. He needs rest, and an infusion of herbs every morning and evening for a few days. And above all, don't let him train just yet. A certain weight seemed to lighten within him as he nodded in response.
Thank you.
The old woman rose to her feet and, with the help of her assistants, began to walk away. When the healer disappeared from their sight, Maxime moved closer to Charles, who was breathing a little easier thanks to the treatment. Charles's tired smile warmed his heart. Maxime crouched down beside Charles, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. So, old chap, you're going to be bedridden for a while, apparently, Maxime said with a smirk. Charles, still pale but obviously in a teasing mood, tried to straighten up slightly. As long as a roof doesn't fall in on me again, I should be fine, he murmured, still in a joking mood.
Maxime shook his head, amused.
In the distance, all the villagers and mercenaries began to gather, including Romuald and the men who had accompanied him to the north, who had returned victorious and without visible wounds. There were murmurs and bursts of admiration. The men had fought with such ferocity that they had managed to repel the orcs with only a score of them. This victory marked a turning point for the village, which had never dared to believe that outsiders could save them from such a threat so suddenly and miraculously. A woman with rosy cheeks flushed with enthusiasm walked up to Maxime, surrounded by several other villagers. "Hello, may we know who you are?" Everyone, the villagers in particular, stopped their chatter and listened attentively. "Hello, we're a group of mercenaries called the Saber-Toothed Tigers," Maxime replied with a reassuring smile. "Mercenaries? You saved us from those creatures. We really thought the orcs were going to slaughter us all. Their strength was far too terrifying." As she said this, the woman still looked terrified. "But you fought with a strength we've never seen." She looked at Maxime with eyes shining with admiration. An older man, with calloused hands and hair bleached by years, stepped forward in turn. It's not common to see a small band of 20 men stand up to a squad of orcs and emerge victorious. Maxime looked at his men with unseen pride. "We trained for this, any mercenary or soldier would have done the same." His humble attitude surprised the mercenaries, who were clearly not used to it. The old man shook his head in respect. Not to mention the courage it takes to take on orcs, very few people would have been able to repel so many orcs with so few men. "You've given us hope we'd totally lost." Laura addressed the villagers sympathetically. "Now everyone needs a rest. If you have any makeshift shelters for us to rest in, we'd be grateful."
The woman shook her head.
"We don't have any makeshift shelters, and especially many of the houses were destroyed during the fighting. But our doors are open to all of you," she continued, flashing a bright smile. Maxime nodded, touched by the sincerity of their welcome, then turned to his fellow mercenaries. "All right everyone, let's follow these good people and get some rest today." The group dispersed into the village, some of the mercenaries exchanging laughter and anecdotes with the villagers who were still cheering them on. Maxime, arms folded, watched the scene with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. He had just saved many lives with his own power, and it was a powerful feeling of satisfaction. Read exclusive adventures at my virtual library empire. He realized that this was the life of a mercenary too. It wasn't all about waging war everywhere, killing people and losing comrades. They could also save lives and get thanks in their own way. Slightly behind, Andrew approached Charles and held out his hand to help him up. "Come on, don't be fragile, with your physique you should be more than able to stand." Charles smiled slightly and took Andrew's hand. Andrew pulled his hand away and helped Charles to his feet. Once up, he leaned on Andrew's shoulder with difficulty. Despite his light words, Andrew was fully aware that Charles's injuries were truly serious. An ordinary person, let alone stand up, would have died long ago. "Indeed, you didn't make the cut for your first battle." Charles looked at Andrew's face in profile with astonishment and emotion. Discover more stories at my virtual library empire. Andrew felt Charles's gaze, but he had no desire to confront it with his own. Getting too attached to others could be too painful. A middle-aged man approached them accompanied by two small children. The two little ones hid behind their father's legs while casting curious glances at Charles and Andrew. Respectable mercenaries, I have a room with an insulated bed for the injured young man, and I can also set up an extra bed for you, sir." Not knowing the mercenaries' first names, the man used his gaze to let Charles and Andrew know who he was talking to. "It would indeed be great if we could stay with you," Charles replied with a smile. "We'd be very grateful," Andrew added without too much emotion. If a bed was suddenly available, it must have been occupied before. Otherwise, the room would have been rearranged. Similar scenes occurred again and again. Every family in the village had lost one or more members, whether children, parents, cousins, or grandparents. But thanks to this, Maxime's little mercenary troop was easily accommodated despite the many destroyed houses. Terry, Izo, Pietro and James settled in together in a house to which they had been invited. The premises were modest, but a fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the fighters' slightly tired faces. Even for them, walking for 3 days outside and then directly confronting orcs was rather exhausting. An elderly woman, who appeared to be the matriarch of the house, approached the group. She had arranged a few chairs in front of the fireplace and placed steaming dishes of soup and still warm bread on the table. "Thank you very much for the meal." James thanked the woman with a smile, while the others nodded gratefully. "Thank you for stepping in." The woman's expression was at once very grateful but also very sad. "Thanks to you, my little baby and I are still living, even if it will be complicated without my husband and my 2 teenagers." James, visibly moved, clenched his fists as he looked at her. "Don't thank us, ma'am. No one should have to go through this, not you, not anyone." Terry, her gaze tranquil, laid a friendly hand on James's shoulder to calm him. "It's precisely because things like this happen that we have to help people in need as much as we can," he said, turning his gaze to the old woman with a reassuring smile. "If we do our job well, maybe one day we can achieve eternal peace in certain regions." Pietro, his face impassive, also gave his opinion. "This is our mission. And when you've got a mission, you don't give up. It doesn't matter how many there are, or how strong they are. We're here to protect." Beside her, Izo remained silent, watching the woman's face. He said nothing, but his unyielding gaze seemed to reassure her far more than long speeches. He seemed particularly reliable. They'd all given a lot of thought to becoming mercenaries, their goals, what they wanted to become, and above all, they'd also thought about Maxime's behavior. If his behavior was really bad, then no matter how talented he was, they would leave and live their lives in a different way. But so far, Maxime was doing a surprisingly good job in his choice of missions, in his strategic thinking, in the values he transmitted and in the way he preserved his men. As a result, they were all very loyal to Maxime, and even if his talent disappeared, he would stay by his side and continue to follow them. The day passed quickly in the village, with discussions, tears and emotional moments. For the evening, a large table had been set up in the village square, where the little food available was gathered for a generous meal. After songs, toasts and stories, a moving ceremony took place to honor the dead. The old woman in the brown dress, respected by all, stepped into the center of the village, carrying in her hands an earthenware bowl filled with ashes and twigs. The villagers had gathered in a silent circle, while the mercenaries stood back in line, observing the scene with respect. Their faces, still scarred by previous battles, were imbued with an unusual solemnity. The old woman slowly raised her arms and murmured an ancient prayer, her husky voice echoing in the silence, punctuated by the rustling of leaves and the crackling of the first stars. A few villagers in turn intoned words in a low, almost hypnotic chant, echoing the healer's voice. The air took on a palpable gravity, and even the mercenaries, unaccustomed to such rituals, froze in deep reverence. She placed the bowl on the ground and began throwing dried herbs into it, invoking the memory of the dead who had fallen to defend the village. Wisps of bluish smoke rose up, carrying with them prayers of protection. At that moment, each villager, from the youngest to the oldest, stepped forward in turn, throwing a handful of earth or a flower into the bowl, a symbol of their gratitude to the mercenaries and their fallen loved ones. Andrew, arms folded, watched the scene, deeply moved by the simplicity and power of this rite. Maxime, at his side, remained impassive, but a glint of gentleness passed through his eyes as he observed the respectful gestures of the villagers towards their dead. Henry and Altia also seemed absorbed in the gravity of the moment, despite their youth and lack of experience. Terry, James, Pietro and Izo stood side by side, each staring into the steaming bowl as if the ashes contained all the suffering and courage of those they had lost. In particular, Peter, Alessandro and Ronnie, who had sadly passed away during the Battle of Plauta, and their family, who had tragically died in Quessois. Rodrigo also observed the scene, his thoughts mixed. Romuald's gaze was deep, he'd known many ways to honor the dead. And during his career as a soldier, he had honored many in different ways. But all were highly respectable, as long as those present had sincere and compassionate thoughts for the dead. After a final chant murmuring the names of the departed, the old woman raised her hands to the sky, her gaunt fingers drawing shapes in the air. Then, in a slow movement, she poured the contents of the bowl into the flames of the brazier at the center of the circle, creating a great flame that lit up the faces of all present. This fire symbolized the passage of souls to a place of eternal rest. The villagers watched the flame in silence, while the mercenaries felt for the first time the depth of this communion. Finally, the healer addressed the mercenaries with a gleam of gratitude in her tired eyes. "You have taken up the burden of battle for us, and our dead rest in peace thanks to your bravery. May this flame grant you the protection of the elders." A respectful silence settled, broken by a few words from Maxime. "We are honored to stand among you tonight." His tone, humble and sincere, echoed in the hearts of the villagers, marking this ceremony with a sense of closeness between villagers and mercenaries. As the flame began to fade, a sense of peace permeated the air, as if the souls had found their rest. In the days that followed, the presence of the mercenaries reassured the village, and little by little, trust grew between the two groups as the traumas of the previous day were slowly hidden deep in the hearts of the villagers. The villagers enjoyed hearing tales of past battles, fascinated by the endurance and bravery of these men who had come from afar to defend strangers. On the morning of the fourth day, horses were spotted on the horizon. An imposing, noble-looking man, surrounded by apprentice knights, entered the village. It was Baron Edrin, who had come to check on his people and the mercenaries who had saved them. He dismounted and went first to speak with a few villagers. After listening to the villagers' stories, he rode over to Maxime and his companions, a grateful smile lighting up his tired face. Edrin bowed slightly in respect. "Maxime, you and your men have accomplished what I thought impossible. My duty should have been to protect them, and yet it was you who saved my village. For that, I am deeply grateful." Maxime, humbled, bowed his head slightly in respect. "Monseigneur, we simply did what we felt was right." The Baron nodded and, touched by this rare humility, laid a hand on his shoulder. "Few mercenaries can boast such loyalty to those they protect. You have my eternal gratitude. If you ever need an ally, Baron Edrin will be at your side." Laura, not far away, watched Maxime, wanting to laugh. Maxime likes to play modest, but all he has in mind is improving his impression of Baron Edrin to increase the reward he can receive from him. Standing next to Maxime, the Baron addressed the assembled villagers and mercenaries. "My friends, this village will rise and prosper again, thanks to the bravery of these men and women. Together, we will rebuild what has been lost." The villagers gave Baron Edrin a standing ovation. Baron Edrin's short speech provoked a wave of enthusiasm among the villagers, their faces lighting up with hope and determination. It seemed that the Baron was particularly popular in his home territory. Once the ovations had died down, Edrin turned his gaze back to Maxime and beckoned him to follow him out of the crowd. Maxime, curious, followed him. Together, they walked to an old restored barn, away from curious ears. Edrin turned back to him, smiling slightly. "Thanks again for saving those villagers." Maxime shook his head and decided to be direct. "We're mercenaries, we save when we can save, but to live we need money." The Baron was surprised by Maxime's transparency, but he didn't let it faze him. "Of course, I'll issue you a reward once we return to Algrand." Saying this, Baron Edrin slightly dodged the question of the reward and its amount with a kind smile. "No, on reflection, I think we'll be going to the county capital of Ravemont, Lappy, soon enough. So send our reward there." Suddenly Maxime looked Baron Edrin directly in the eye. "I sincerely hope to get a reward commensurate with the difficulty of the task, if not. Experience tales at my virtual library empire." Maxime didn't finish his sentence, and simply decided to continue staring at the Baron. At that very moment, the Baron sensed that a dangerous beast was staring at him like prey. This young man, who at first seemed so kind and naive, could have such a face. Suddenly, he realized the problem. How could a small squad of 20 men sweep away 30 orcs? To be honest, he'd known about these orcs for a long time, but he hadn't come because he didn't have the strength to get rid of them. He'd only come here because he'd received the news that the village hadn't been destroyed. When he heard this news, he couldn't believe his ears. So he decided to take a look around. When he saw that there were only about 20 mercenaries, most of them very young, he couldn't believe they'd managed to get rid of the orcs. For this reason, he intended to send only 50 gold coins, while promising them various benefits. Even sending them 50 gold pieces made his heart ache, given the age of the mercenaries. But at least with this sum, his reputation would be preserved and these young mercenaries would be completely won over by him. However, Maxime's threat changed his plans completely. If he sent such a small sum, he had no doubt that the young man would take his men to ransack his territory. Of course, I'll send you a reward that's appropriately commensurate with the task you've performed, plus a gift of gratitude for saving my villagers. On hearing these words, Maxime smiled at Baron Edrin and stopped staring. I dare not doubt the Baron's nobility. As he said this, Maxime kept a hint of menace in his words. But Baron Edrin ignored this, put on a serious face and addressed the main fact for which he had invited Maxime into discreet surroundings. I've received rumors of orc movements intensifying in the region. Count Arden, though powerful and possessing a mighty army, he seems slightly overwhelmed by the orc attacks which are multiplying in all directions. Edrin sighed, then glanced outside, easily able to see the destroyed buildings. That's why I'd like to hire you more, officially. Not only to defend this village, but my entire territory. In making this wish, Edrin was thinking selfishly. With the strength of these mercenaries, he could retain his military power while earning certain military merits. But Maxime shook his head. I told you we're not going to stay here long. Our aim is to fight our way through the entire southern territory, earn as many gold coins as possible and then return to the north.
The Baron frowned.
I can pay you very well for very little risk. If you venture into the warring territories unprepared, you'll die without even knowing how. Maxime kept a slight smile, without answering. He didn't need to say that his 20 men could literally sweep through Baron Edrin's territory, and that on top of that he had a super powerful talent as an asset. Seeing Maxime's lack of reaction, the Baron regained his composure so as not to spoil his relationship with these powerful mercenaries. After all, if they survived, he'd forge a relationship with powerful mercenaries without spending too much. I respect your decision, and I hope you leave the south with wealth and honor. Then he gestured to Maxime to join the villagers again. Tonight, we will celebrate your bravery. You all deserve an evening of peace before you set out again. As evening fell, the entire village was illuminated by torches and bonfires. The villagers had gathered colorful chairs, tables and tablecloths, adorned with simple wildflower decorations. The small central square vibrated with a festive atmosphere, filled with laughter, song and music, and the mercenaries mingled with the villagers like long-lost companions. Several hours after Baron Edrin's arrival, several carriages filled with food arrived in the village, making the evening a gustatory delight for all. Charles, still pale but determined to participate, leaned on Andrew to join the party. The latter supported him, not without an amused smile. Are you really in a state right now? Charles forced a smile. I can't shirk my first victorious evening, can I? It would be too pitiful. Andrew thought about it seriously and surprisingly agreed. Indeed, it would be rather sad. After all, this is the start of your mercenary career, so it has to be glorious when you tell it later. Charles laughs lightly. We agree. Later I could tell the new recruits that after being badly wounded, I completely ignored the pain and drowned myself in alcohol and women who admired me for my courage. Thinking about it, Charles had dreamy eyes. But looking at Charles, Andrew had a mocking laugh. Look at you clinging to my shoulder like a koala. Your charisma with the village women must be at an all-time high. Charles rolled his eyes. Anyway, when I ride my dragon and become known all over the world, no one will dare to doubt my words. Hearing this, Andrew felt slightly sad, but his sadness went unnoticed by Charles. Still, you must survive until then. His words like a whisper were heard by Charles, who became displeased. Of course I'll survive. Need I remind you that you almost died in your first battle, a battle that was won easily but in which you were still the only one seriously wounded? Charles was speechless at Andrew's repartee and looked at him with disgruntled eyes, but he couldn't help laughing as he realized the reality. At the center of the festivities, Pietro and Terry began an impromptu drinking contest, accompanied by a few hilarious villagers. Terry, grinning mischievously, turned to other mercenaries and villagers. If anyone manages to keep up with me, I promise I'll respond to any request they make. Laughter resounded. Either I'll follow you, Terry. If I win, I want you to teach me some self-defense moves. A burly villager lifted his tankard and challenged Terry with a very serious look despite his flushed face. Other villagers were suddenly excited. I'm going with you too. If you lose the mercenaries, you'll have to teach us how to fight. The mercenaries may know how to fight, but I'm sure they can't beat our villagers trained from generation to generation to get drunk every day. Pietro found this interesting and laughed aloud. Well, let's see which of us is stronger. A little way back, Maxime watched the scene with satisfaction and above all with a mysterious look in his eyes. A few thoughts crossed his mind. But he was cut off by Rodrigo, who approached, carrying a mug of beer, and held it out. To you, Chief. This evening is dedicated to you too. Maxime accepted the drink, a smile of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Rodrigo." They toasted in silence, the air imbued with mutual gratitude, before Maxime added, his gaze plunged toward the night horizon. "I really like this kind of evening after a battle." Rodrigo nodded, looking thoughtful. "Yeah, they have a special flavor. But don't you think it's strange, Maxime, that orcs have already gone so deep into human territory?" Maxime looked at Rodrigo without changing his expression as he sipped lightly from his mug of beer. "What makes you think so?" Rodrigo watched Maxime carefully before answering, as if measuring every word. "Let's just say it doesn't fit with what we know about orcs. They're brutal, yes, but their territory is far from here, and they don't usually venture this deep into human territory without a reason." He paused, staring at an invisible point in the darkness. Something must have prompted them to move, to risk open warfare. Maxime remained silent for a moment, eyes squinting, and finally nodded in agreement. He'd had this thought before, but hearing it from Rodrigo confirmed his suspicions. In all the courses in the real world, it was said that when there were orcs, they were usually easily repelled, and in any case the orcs didn't venture deep into human territory. If they did, then it was sensible to assume that something was afoot. This could range from simple famine among the orcs or particularly high reproduction, to internal tribal conflicts. And in the worst case, the birth of an orc king. Thinking about this, Maxime was worried. If there was an orc king, then it wasn't just the south that was in danger, it was the whole kingdom. For to become the orc king and unite all the tribes, one had to be far more powerful than a great knight, at least comparable to an epic knight. Indeed, among the orcs there were already many comparable to great knights, so this was the minimum. "That's what I think too," murmured Maxime. Rodrigo grinned, shaking his head in puzzlement. "I just hope we don't get embroiled in a war that totally overpowers us." Their gazes exchanged a gleam of silent understanding. The mission, filled with glory for some, had just taken on a darker dimension for those who knew how to observe beyond the obvious. While the party was in full swing, the laughter and singing of the villagers filled the square, creating a warm atmosphere that contrasted with the two men's anxiety. A few children approached them laughing, their little hands outstretched towards Maxime and Rodrigo, asking for a dance. Rodrigo, reluctant at first, finally gave in to the children's pleas with a smile, while Maxime stood by and watched them dance awkwardly together. This soon began to drift into Rodrigo having fun making the children fly. With his large size and powerful physique, he had no trouble carrying several children at once. Returning to Terry and Piedro's side, the beer contest was in full swing. A stocky villager named Garin, a red-cheeked former soldier with eyes shining with amusement, raised his tankard with a provocative smile in Terry's direction. "Well, mercenary? Still up and about? You look like you're having trouble keeping up." Terry burst out laughing, but his voice trailed a little, and his gaze was already getting a little fuzzy. "Pooh. What do you take me for, Garin? You can drink barrels and still walk straight afterwards. Right, Piedro?" Piedro, whose eyelids seemed to be fighting gravity, nodded vigorously in support, but his hand was visibly betraying him. He trembled as he lifted his tankard, which made many of the villagers laugh. "Exactly. No villager can bend mercenaries of our caliber." His drunken, hesitant voice provoked another round of laughter from the villagers. Although they were beginning to feel equally hot-headed, none seemed intimidated, they knew that time was on their side. Piedro and Terry, however, impressed them. Between them, they were competing against a dozen people. A young woman named Lyra raised her glass with a glint of mischief in her eyes. "It's all very well to brag, but it looks like you're starting to lose color, especially Terry. Your next journey awaits at my virtual library empire. It's not me who's fading, it's just the firelight that's making everything blurry." The villagers burst out laughing as Terry struggled to keep his balance on his stool. Piedro, for his part, clutched at Terry's shoulder, his head beginning to spin dangerously. "Terry, I think I have an idea. Why don't we take a break, just to recalculate, you know?" "Recalculate what?" Piedro whispered softly in Terry's ear. "I've got a plan. Let's pretend we're going to take a leak, but actually we're going to do what I call tactical puking." Terry opened his eyes wide in surprise. Then he shook his head and looked at Piedro as if he were staring at an idiot. "There's a flaw in your plan there. Do you really think we can walk right now?" At the same moment, and seeing the situation, Garin stood up and brandished his tankard to launch the final blow. "Well, my friends, I think we can declare victory for the villagers. Those mercenaries certainly don't have any legs left to stand on." The villagers exulted, clapping their hands and laughing out loud. Piedro, in a final burst of pride, tried to stand up, but missed and collapsed in the straw nearby. Seeing his college in this state, Terry admitted defeat.
Okay, you win.
But training will be rescheduled for another day. Lyra, still mischievous, came dangerously close to Terry's face. That's a pity, I really wanted to train tonight. Terry became suddenly shy, he'd never had any experience with women until now. He tried to look at Lyra's face, but every time he tried to concentrate, his vision was blurred, and the darkness of the night wasn't making things any easier. Then suddenly a sweet sensation landed on his lips. Startled, Terry lost his balance and fell backwards into the hay with Lyra. All the villagers began to whistle and shout with enthusiasm as the two began to kiss languorously despite the situation. Laura and James arrived just then, surprised by what was happening. James, raising an eyebrow, lightly tapped Laura's shoulder to get her attention, an amused smile on his lips. Well, little Terry's going to be Big Terry tonight. Laura shook her head with a laugh, one hand on her hip. Maybe I should have brought the buckets of water earlier to calm things down, but at least they've integrated well with the villagers. James began to laugh merrily. That's not integration anymore, that's fusion. On the other hand, believe me, if you had spilled a bucket of water on them, whether you were the chief's wife or not, all the mercenaries would have cursed you to your death. Sex is sacred. James was extremely convinced by what he was saying, which exasperated Laura, and so she huffed slightly.
All the same.
Seeing Laura and James arrive, a few enthusiastic villagers raised their tankards in the direction of the mercenaries. Garen was excited when he saw them.
Hey, here come some mercenaries.
If you've got any energy left, why don't you show us some techniques?
Huh?
Why should we have to do that? Replied Laura with slight annoyance. Your colleagues promised us. Laura and James looked at Pietro slumped in straw and obviously sleeping, then at Terry immersed in some of the world's greatest happiness. Then they both looked at each other and laughed. Okay, we're going to teach you a few little techniques. Laura took a more serious tone, although the smile in her eyes betrayed her amusement. First, let's start with a warm-up, and maybe the losers of this beer contest can show us what they can do once they wake up. Pietro, still sprawled in the hay, raised a hand weakly, mumbling in a pasty voice. I'm coming, wait for me, just a moment. The villagers laughed harder, but several of them gathered around, forming a circle around Laura and James with curious faces ready to learn more. Laura assumed a steady posture, observing the villagers benevolently. Self-defense isn't just about strength, but speed and reflexes. Who's up for starting? A young man, still a little tipsy but full of determination, stood up awkwardly and stepped forward. Me. I want to be able to defend my family. Laura nodded and approached him.
Perfect.
Start by showing me how you'd throw a punch. The young man assumed a slightly hesitant posture and threw a clumsy punch forward, almost tripping. Laura held back a smile, then patiently adjusted his posture, showing him how to balance his weight on his feet and where to position his arms to stay steady. There you go. Keep your elbows close to your body, and try to pivot with your body to give strength. If you're off balance, you'll be an easy target, and you won't last against an experienced enemy. Gradually, other villagers joined in the impromptu training, encouraged by James, who showed the stronger ones how to keep a low guard and make quick dodges. The atmosphere remained upbeat, while laughter could be heard in the distance. A camaraderie had begun to form between the villagers and the mercenaries. A few hours passed, and the calm of the night gradually descended on the village as the campfires were extinguished one by one. The next morning, while the village was still asleep, Maxime gathered his men in the dawning light, his features serious. He explained the situation, making no secret of his doubts or the urgency of the situation. Each mercenary listened in silence, aware of the more complex mission ahead. Andrew stepped forward, breaking the silence with a firm voice. Who cares, let's just get to the places where we can help, and if it's too dangerous we can always run. Ernest intervened as well. Hothead is right, this situation is even advantageous for us because previously the nobles' military forces were sufficient. Who are you calling Hothead, Ernest? Intervened Andrew with a sullen face. Ernest, however, ignored him completely. But now they tend to get overwhelmed. Maxime ignored the brief confrontation and nodded. He stared at them all, his gaze imbued with unshakable resolution. We leave for Lappy tomorrow. However, a question nagged at the back of Maxime's mind.